A city between two rivers, you are standing figuratively in the cradle of civilization. Not in the loud, chaotic pages of empire building or dramatic wars, but in the quiet murmur of an early city waking to life. The city is Babylon. The time is somewhere around 1700 BCE. The sun is low, casting long, sluggish shadows over the beige brick streets. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow patiently nearby, and somewhere a scribe with careful hands and a clay tablet is trying to solve a problem so mundane it's almost poetic. How to tell time when there are no clocks. Babylon, despite what you might imagine, was not just a kingdom of conquest and law codes. It was also a society that valued the practical details of life. Planting, harvesting, building, bathing, resting, and all of it required an understanding of time. The passage of time wasn't just philosophical, it was necessary. And before mechanical gears, ticking watches, and smartphone alarms, ancient Babylonians began their day by watching the sky and listening to the sound of water. They weren't the first to care about time, but they were among the first to record their methods. Let's begin not with kings and temples, but with something much more ordinary, the shadow of a stick. Known as a gnomon, this was the simplest version of what would become the sundial, a small vertical pole planted into the ground, its shadow stretching long in the morning and shrinking by midday. That shrinking and stretching observed and noted became a language of time, but it was imperfect. What about cloudy days? What about night? This is where the jug comes in. The clepsydra, or water clock, was among the most stable timekeeping devices before the advent of mechanical clocks thousands of years later. Imagine a clay vessel with a tiny hole at the bottom. It's filled with water. As the water drips out, time is measured by the changing water level. Or, inversely, some water clocks worked by allowing water to drip into the vessel, rising up, to mark divisions etched or painted on the inside wall. You might be surprised to know there were no minute hands, no gears, no ticking. Instead, Babylonian time was measured in the most unhurried, rhythmic way, by the patient flow of water. In temples and in palaces, these devices served both the elite and the priesthood. For ordinary citizens, the rising and setting of the sun sufficed. Still, the development of timekeeping systems through water and shadow reflected something deeply human, the desire to understand and regulate daily life. In Babylonian society, priests were among the few who had reason to measure time precisely. The timing of rituals, sacrifices, and prayers depended on celestial events, lunar calendars, guided festivals. Astrological observations, meticulously etched into clay tablets, required precise timing. If a star appeared just above the horizon, at a specific hour, it could mean a coming drought, or a favorable time for planting barley. The priests, therefore, watched the sky not for beauty, but for structure. And to watch the sky properly, one must know when to look. Time here was sacred, not because of its fleeting nature, but because it allowed for predictability. And predictability was survival. That's worth noting. The Babylonians didn't divide the day into 24 hours the way we do. They used a sexagesimal base 60 number system. 60 was a favorite number, divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, perfect for measuring intervals. This is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, echoes of Babylonian mathematics, whispering through your modern clock. The city of Babylon itself was meticulously structured, its streets laid out in deliberate patterns, its buildings rising in organized tiers. In such a world, the flow of water from a clay jug, or the movement of a shadow across a tablet marked with lines, mirrored the city's own rhythm. Let us pause and consider what that daily rhythm felt like. Imagine a temple courtyard at dawn. A scribe waits beside a gnomon, a simple stick, watching its shadow reach across the polished stone. He scratches a mark on a clay tablet, then waits again. Numbered rush. The sun continues its patient climb. A breeze rolls in from the river's dot. In another corner of the city, a priest watches the water in a clay bowl rise. A ritual must begin when the water touches the fourth line. Not before, not after. He watches, maybe bored, maybe solemn, maybe both. The line is reached. A bell is struck. The day continues. That we often think of history in terms of explosions, wars, revolutions, invasions, but the more honest version of history is like the water clock, slow, dripping, mundane. And in that mundanity, people invented some of the most important structures of modern life. The Babylonian understanding of time influenced later civilizations. The Egyptians would expand on sundials, the Greeks would refine water clocks, the Romans would borrow and build. Eventually, mechanical clocks would rise in medieval Europe. But beneath them all is that quiet Babylonian thought. How long is this shadow? How far has this water fallen? And so, in a way, timekeeping began not with drama, but with boredom, with watching, with waiting, with noting where the shadow was yesterday, and where it is today. But what happens when the water runs too quickly? When the jug leaks too much? When the sky is overcast, and the gnomon casts no shadow? In other words, what happens when time itself begins to feel ... unreliable? When time began to slip, you've heard of the Babylonian sundial and water clock. You've stood in the shadows of their gnomons, and you've waited beside the slow dripping of clay jugs. But now, imagine this. What if the tools for measuring time didn't agree with each other? That was the quiet crisis of ancient Babylon. At first glance, it might seem minor, an inconsistency between shadow and water, between the movement of the sun and the dripping of a vessel. But in a civilization that built its very identity around predictability of stars, seasons, floods, and festivals, even the smallest irregularity in timekeeping created doubt, confusion, and debate. Let's begin where many things in Babylon started, in the temple. The ziggurats, those great stepped towers that reached toward the sky, were not just monuments to the gods. They were also observatories. Priests climbed to their summits, not to worship in the traditional sense, but to observe. They charted the stars. They watched the planets. They tracked the moon's cycles. Their calendars were lunar, their rituals solar, and all of this needed to fit within a measurable system of time. So what happened when the sundial said noon, but the water clock lagged behind? It wasn't just a clerical issue, it was a cosmological one, you see. To a Babylonian priest, time wasn't just a human invention, it was a divine pattern. If the tools for measuring time didn't align, perhaps it meant the gods were displeased, or perhaps more practically something was wrong with the instruments themselves. In response, Babylonian scholars and scribes began to record discrepancies. Clay tablets survive today with lists of timings, how long a shadow should be at a certain hour during a certain month. Some tablets even note, shadow longer than expected, or water vessel emptied early. These aren't just technical notes. They are signs of a society wrestling with the limitations of its own inventions. Now, let's explore the instruments more closely. The sundial, though clever, depended entirely on visibility. Clouds ruined everything. Dust storms come in Mesopotamia, even the clearest days. And there was also a seasonal problem. The length of daylight changes throughout the year. A shadow at midday in summer was not the same as one at midday in winter. Babylonians eventually developed a crude understanding of this, adjusting their expectations as the months changed. But the sundial always carried with it a sense of unreliability. Beautiful in theory, frustrating in practice. The water clock, by contrast, was more consistent, but far from perfect. The viscosity of water changed with temperature. In the summer, heat, water would flow faster. In winter, slower. If the hole in the clay vessel wasn't perfectly smooth, the rate would change. If a bit of dust or debris blocked the flow, time was lost or gained without notice. Some inventive scribes tried to solve this by using oil instead of water. Others experimented with controlling temperature using shaded areas or insulation, but each solution led to new problems. And so time became slippery. Still, the Babylonians did not give up. They kept measuring, they kept comparing. They didn't throw away their water clocks or sundials. Instead, they layered systems together. Some temples used dual timekeeping, one shadow-based, one water-based. Others relied on astronomical markers. The rising of certain stars, particularly Sirius, called Mole, Kak.C.D in their cuneiform, became an anchor for timekeeping. This alignment of tools, symbols, and methods reflected not just technical skill but also philosophical adaptability. Didn't believe time was the sundial or the water clock. Time was something else, something divine that they could glimpse through these imperfect instruments. Now picture yourself again in the city of Babylon, that you are a junior temple scribe. Your job is tedious. Every morning before dawn, you check the water clock to see how much time has passed in the night. You mark the level on a clay tablet. Then you climb the temple steps and check the sky. You record the stars still visible. You mark the position of Venus, perhaps. You descend again. You wait for sunrise. You mark the shadow of the GNOMON. One day, the water clock runs dry too early, but the stars are in their usual place. The gnomon casts its shadow on the correct line. You don't panic. You simply write it down clepsydra fast by 1 finger width. You record the temperature. You note the wind. And you make a small correction in the calendar for that day. No drama, just detail. And that was the brilliance of Babylon. Its bureaucracy. It's easy to think of scribes as boring, desk-bound figures, but they were among the most respected people in Mesopotamian society. Their job was to keep the world in order not through law, but through numbers. And what is time if not a number we live by? In fact, much of our modern math-algebra, geometry, astronomy grew out of the needs of these scribes. They created tables of rising times, shadow lengths, and eclipse cycles. They even predicted lunar eclipses using what would later be called the Saros cycle, an 18-year period after which eclipses repeat. Let's return, briefly, to the gnomon. A simple stick in the ground, yes, but it was sometimes part of something more elaborate, the shadow board. This was a flat surface, often circular or square, marked with divisions. When placed in the right orientation, the gnomon's shadow would cross these lines, marking hours. Some boards were designed for specific seasons, adjusted throughout the year. One particularly clever method involved portable sundials, carved into clay or stone. These devices had slots for different times of year. The user would place the gnomon into the correct hole, align the device with true north, and observe the shadow's position. Imagine the patience it took to develop this, to sit, day after day, marking shadows, to compare notes across years, to conclude that the sun's path changes with the seasons, to understand, without telescopes or satellites, that time on Earth is not fixed but celestial. And yet, for all this effort, their world still ran on very human time. Shops opened at dawn, workers stopped when the sun was overhead, meals were shared at dusk. People lived by light and rest, not by minutes and seconds. There was no rush hour, no alarm clock. Time was measured but not obeyed. Still, the ambition to control time, to predict it, mark it, understand it never faded. The Babylonians used their systems not just for daily life, but for statecraft. They aligned calendars with royal decrees. They scheduled tax collections with the lunar months. They timed battles to the favorable omens of the stars. And that brings us to a darker truth. Time was also a tool of power. If the priesthood said the ritual must occur at the third shadow line, then the people obeyed. If the scribes declared a new month based on celestial markers, then all commerce adjusted. Timekeeping was not just practical, it was authoritative. And when the instruments disagreed, when the sundial and the water clock clashed, who decided what time it really was? Usually, the priests. They had the highest vantage point, both literally and socially. From their towers, they observed not just the sky, but the city itself, and in deciding what the correct time was, they subtly shaped everything else. So, the question becomes, how much of time is science, and how much is consensus? Today, we live by atomic clocks. Nanoseconds matter, but in Babylon, time was a gentle negotiation between the elements, sun, water, clay, and stars. When those elements drifted apart, Babylon didn't panic. It observed, adjusted, recorded, and in doing so they built something remarkable. Not a perfect clock, but a culture of patience, accuracy, and adaptation. Now let's step back for a moment. You've watched the sundial stretch and shrink. You've heard the water drip into its jug. You've climbed the temple steps, recorded the stars, corrected the clocks. You've seen the tension between precision and nature, between tool and reality, and you're left with this. What did a Babylonian feel when time slipped? Was it anxiety, doubt, or perhaps a quiet acceptance that all instruments, even sacred ones, are flawed? That maybe the purpose of timekeeping wasn't to control time, but to honor it, to recognize its flow, to mark it, and to accept that even in its measurement, time remains a mystery. The legacy that kept ticking. The sun set slowly over Babylon, casting long shadows across its carefully planned streets. Somewhere near the temple, a clay water clock releases its final drops into a basin, its quiet dripping barely audible over the ambient murmur of city life. The shadow of the gnomon retreats into darkness, and the stars begin their slow emergence in the sky overhead. But even in the silence, time keeps ticking in minds, in rituals, in memory. Now we enter the final piece of this ancient puzzle. You've seen how the Babylonians measured time with both water and shadows. You've watched them wrestle with inconsistency, layering tools and calendars to form an approximate harmony with the cosmos. But what happened after Babylon? What became of their seemingly modest, repetitive inventions? You may be surprised to learn that these devices, primitive as they might seem, laid the groundwork for how entire civilizations approached time for the next 2 millennia. Let's start with the water clock, or clepsydra. Its use expanded far beyond Babylon's boundaries. As trade and conquest pushed Babylonian culture outward, neighboring civilizations took notice of their timekeeping methods. The Egyptians, who already had rudimentary sundials of their own, adopted water clocks and began modifying them. Around 1400 BCE, they developed large stone water clocks used primarily in temples to track the night hours, especially during long religious ceremonies that demanded precise timing in darkness. In fact, one of the oldest surviving water clocks discovered in the Karnak Temple of Amun in Thebes is distinctly Egyptian but bears unmistakable traces of Babylonian influence. It's inscribed with columns of markings that divide time into segments based on seasonal hours. These are not mechanical hours as we know them today, but rather temple hours, flexible and bound to the rhythm of light and darkness. Later, the Greeks, particularly during the classical and Hellenistic periods, would elevate the clepsydra from a simple dripping pot into a complex machine. Engineers like Ctesibius in 3rd century BCE Alexandria designed water clocks with gears, dials, and even miniature statues that struck bells to announce the passing of time. In Athens, the clepsydra was used in the law courts to limit how long someone could speak. Justice, apparently, had a time limit, but it all began with those slow dripping vessels in Babylonian temples. Each drop, each mark on the clay wall, a quiet revolution in measuring the day. The sundial followed a similar journey. After Babylon, the device was embraced and refined by the Greeks, who introduced trigonometry into its design. The famous Greek mathematician and astronomer Hipparchus created sundials that took latitude into account, recognizing that a sundial designed for Babylon would not work properly in Athens or Rome without adjustment. Later, the Romans adopted and standardized sundials throughout their vast empire. In fact, one Roman general, Marcus Valerius Masella, famously brought a large sundial back from Sicily and erected it in the Roman Forum in 263 BCE. The only problem, the latitude was different, and it didn't tell time accurately. It reportedly confused the Romans for nearly a century until it was replaced with a properly calibrated version. Yet, despite these hiccups, the central idea that time could be measured by shadows persisted. Sundials became not just tools, but symbols of order and discipline. In cities across the Roman world, they adorned gardens, walls, forums, and temples, offering both function and philosophical musing. The Latin phrase often inscribed on sundials was Horus non numero nisi serenas, I count only the sunny hours, and beneath all that Latin polish, a Babylonian stick and shadow. Now let's return to Babylon one last time. It's easy to think of it as an ancient city swallowed by time itself. After all, by the time Alexander the Great marched into Babylon in 331 BCE, its glory had long faded. The canals had silted, the temples were crumbling. The ziggurat of Etemenunki, once the supposed inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, was in ruins. But even as its bricks fell, Babylon's influence quietly endured. Its scribes, centuries before Alexander's arrival, had created clay tablets recording astronomical and temporal data so precise that modern historians still marvel at their accuracy. One particular example is the Mal-Apen tablets compiled around 1000 BCE, which contain extensive lists of star positions, constellations, planetary motion, and even timekeeping systems. These weren't mystical charts, they were observational, scientific, and methodical. From these, we know how Babylonians divided the day and night into 12-hour periods, leading to our modern 24-hour day. We also know they used the sexagesimal system base 60 not only for mathematical convenience, but because it allowed easy subdivision, an ancient solution to the problem of how to evenly divide the uneven 60. After all, divides into halves, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, and so on, far better than a Baseton system for timekeeping. That's why even today, our clocks tick in multiples of 60, 60 seconds, 60 minutes. Every digital countdown, every hourly chime, every wristwatch, modern, sleek, and efficient, carries the DNA of Babylonian arithmetic. But time is more than numbers. For Babylon, time had character. It was cyclical, tied to celestial rhythms. The gods moved through the heavens in predictable loops. Venus disappeared, then returned. The moon waxed and waned. Even eclipses once feared became routine under the careful eye of the scribes. To manage such pattern, the Babylonians invented the concept of the intercalary month, adding a 13th month to certain years in order to keep their lunar calendar aligned with the solar year. This decision wasn't made arbitrarily. Priests consulted astronomical tables and sometimes omens before inserting the extra month. In doing so, they acknowledge something profound. Time is not always neat, but we can work with its in a way. This remains true today. Our modern leap year adding an extra day every 4 years is the descendant of the Babylonian into our time zones, daylight savings, calendar apps, and spring forward, fallback rituals all echo the same dilemma Babylon once faced: how to make time fit. But perhaps what's most lasting from Babylon is not the devices they built or the calendars they adjusted, but the attitude they developed toward time. It was an attitude of respect, of partnership, of coexistence. Time wasn't a thing to be controlled. It wasn't a race to run or an enemy to beat. It was something to watch, to observe, to measure with patience, to record with humility. The water clock and the sundial were not prisons, but companions. You sat with them, you checked their progress, you accepted their flaws, you adapted your day. And so, as the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates slowly cut into the soil of Mesopotamia, carrying silt and memory downstream, so too did the Babylonians' quiet innovations cut a path through history. Today, we live by precise atomic clocks. Our GPS systems rely on microsecond synchronization. Traders on Wall Street buy and sell stocks in milliseconds. We feel we are always running out of time, that we must manage it, optimize it, hack it. But perhaps Babylon offers a different lesson: to sit with time, to watch its drip, to follow its shadow, to know that it can't always be made perfect, and that's okay. Imagine yourself once more in ancient Babylon. The stars are overhead. You hold a clay tablet etched with columns of numbers. A water clock glimmers faintly by firelight. A sundial rests nearby, waiting for the sun to return. You listen to the silence between each drop. You feel the earth rotating slowly beneath your feet. And you realize something profound. You're not keeping time. Time is keeping you. Story 2: the Roman public toilets. Hygiene, gossip, and sponge sticks where everyone knew your business. You wake in the early hours of a Roman morning. The sun hasn't yet risen above the red-tiled roofs of Ostia or Pompeii. Birds begin their usual chorus, and in the narrow alleys between buildings, servants are already sweeping dust from thresholds. The baker heats the oven, the aqueduct hums with flowing water. And down the block, past the open-air market and beside the bathhouse, lies one of Rome's most essential and curiously communal inventions: the latrina publica, Roman public toilet. This is not just a pit in the ground. It's an engineered structure of surprising sophistication. There are no walls separating users, no sense of privacy. Instead, there's a long marble or stone bench, typically with 20 or more evenly spaced holes. Beneath the holes flows a shallow channel of water. Another small channel, at the user's feet, constantly brings fresh water for washing. And beside each hole rests an item both ordinary and, to the modern mind, slightly horrifying: a sponge attached to a stick, soaked in vinegar or salty water. Rome's version of toilet paper. Welcome to one of the busiest and most surprisingly social hubs of ancient Roman daily life. The Roman world was built on precision, order, and public function. Roads, baths, amphitheaters, aqueducts all were designed not just for utility, but to promote Roman values of cleanliness, structure, and shared civic space. Public toilets were no exception. They were found throughout the empire: in Italy, in Roman Britain, in the Levant, North Africa, and Gaul, from massive latrines built to serve hundreds in cities like Ephesus, to smaller facilities in roadside rest stations. The toilet was as Roman as the toga. But before we dive into the mechanics and the meaning of these latrines, consider what they replaced. In early Roman times, and certainly before the Republic's expansion, private waste disposal was a messy affair. Homes had chamber pots. Waste was thrown into pits or onto the street. The Cloaca Maxima. Rome's legendary sewer was originally built not to serve toilets, but to drain swampy land near the Forum. But as the city grew and its infrastructure matured, so too did its approach to hygiene. By the 1st century BC, Rome was obsessed with public sanitation. Baths were everywhere. Water was sacred, brought in from mountains via stone aqueducts, flowing in fountains, basins, and pipes. It wasn't long before this water was directed, with equal pride, toward another essential human need. Let's take a walk now into one of these Roman latrines. It is mid-morning. The stone benches are cool to the touch. You take your place beside a stranger or two or three. Perhaps you exchange greetings. Perhaps you don't, but you can hear the murmur of conversation. Yes, conversation. The Roman toilet was a public forum of its own. There was no taboo about discussing matters of business. philosophy, or politics while relieving oneself. In fact, many letters and ancient accounts refer to public latrines as places where gossip flowed as easily as the water channels. Clients waited beside their patrons, senators talked shop, slaves whispered secrets they overheard. It was, in short, a place to catch up on news, ideas, and rumors. Even Roman graffiti hints at this social function. In the latrines of Pompeii, one can find scratched messages like "Secundus defecated here" or crude jokes about fellow users. As crude as it may seem, these scrawlings show that even the most basic human experience could be shared, recorded, and remembered. Now, let's turn to hygiene. At the foot of each user was a narrow trough, flowing with clean water, and near every toilet hole, a sponge stickdosorium was kept. After use, it would be dipped in the trough, squeezed clean, perhaps rinsed in a vinegar solution if one was nearby, and returned for the next user. That might sound repulsive by modern standards, but in a world without paper, and in a society deeply attuned to the use of water for cleansing, it was both logical and consistent with Roman cleanliness practices. In fact, some scholars believe the Roman obsession with public baths extended to public latrines. Hygiene was about visible order, not necessarily germ theory, which they didn't yet understand. Still, the idea of flowing water, regular rinsing, and community upkeep marked these spaces as places of ritual and routine. But there was also a dark side. Despite the flowing water and fresh air, Roman latrines were not without hazard. Parasites thrived in the warm, moist conditions. Flies gathered, and the famous Roman engineer Vitruvius even noted the danger of explosive gases building up in underground cells. These dangers weren't always theoretical. Some ancient texts describe latrines catching fire due to methane buildup ignited by nearby oil lamps. To combat this, many public toilets were designed with ventilation shafts and flowing water systems that helped reduce stagnant waste and odor. Some even included small fountains or water features, perhaps not just for cleansing, but also for masking the smell. And here's where Roman engineering shines. The best designed latrines were connected to the city's wider sewer systems, including the Cloaca Maxima, allowing waste to be carried far away from the urban center. Gravity did most of the work, pulling waste downhill toward rivers or outflows. Some latrines even had sluice gates, which could be opened periodically to flush out the entire system in one powerful sweep. This was not ad hoc sanitation. It was planned, maintained, and publicly funded. Still, not everyone used the public toilet. Many elite Romans had private latrines in their villas. These were smaller, often single-seaters, tucked away near the kitchen or bath areas. They were connected to cesspits or sewers, and sometimes even featured decorative mosaics. But even here, the sponge stick prevailed. And for those without access to public or private facilities, the street. Roman cities had their share of waste in the alleys. Chamber pots were emptied into the gutters. Laws existed to prevent people from dumping waste out their windows during daylight hours, implying that doing so at night was still common. It was not a perfect system, but compared to many ancient cities or even many pre-modern ones, approach to sanitation was remarkably organized. The latrine then was more than a place to relieve oneself. It was part of a grand Roman philosophy, that order and engineering could elevate even the basest human needs. To build a latrine required planning, stonecutters, water engineers, maintenance crews. It needed regular cleaning. It required community, trust, not just to keep it tidy, but to use it respectfully. And it served as a literal and figurative cornerstone of Roman urban life. Imagine, again, sitting on that cool stone bench. You listen to the water gurgling below. You hear the echo of conversation bouncing off the tiled walls. Someone is talking politics, another grumbles about taxes. Someone else, perhaps a poet, shares a joke. You are doing something as old as humanity, but in a setting uniquely Roman, engineered, shared, communal, and open. And maybe you begin to wonder, how did Rome become so comfortable with what so many other societies hide? The answer lies not in grandeur, but in function. To Rome, greatness wasn't just about legions and emperors. It was about functionality, about making the everyday better, more efficient, more ordered. The latrine, though humble, was as essential as the aqueduct or the road, and perhaps even more telling of what it meant to be Roman. But as with all things, empires crumble, systems decay, public funds dry up, latrines fall into disrepair. So the question lingers, what happened to these temples of sanitation when the empire began to rot? Decline of the sponge stick empire. It is now the 3rd century CE. Rome is beginning to show its cracks. The borders are strained, barbarians test the northern limits, taxes rise, emperors come and go, some killed in office, others forgotten within months. But even as marble statues remain polished and roads remain straight, a subtler decline creeps in, a decay not of the battlefield, but of the bathhouse, and the latrine. If you had entered a Roman public toilet in the first centuries, in the bustling port city of Ostiode, find it functioning, clean by Roman standards, and busy. By the 3rd or 4th century, things begin to shift. The troughs no longer flow as often, the sponge sticks may be dry or missing, graffiti multiplies on the walls, and instead of the hum of gossip, the room is quieter, fewer people come. Maintenance is inconsistent. The stone benches begin to crack. This section of the story explores the unnoticed decline, how an empire's fall was mirrored in its most humble places, including the public toilets that once served as both hygienic marvels and social hubs. Water interrupted. To understand the breakdown of Roman public sanitation, we must first revisit Rome's most prized asset, water. Rome's water system, especially in the capital, was massive. By the peak of the empire, the city had at least 11 major aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant springs and mountains into urban centers. These aqueducts supplied fountains, bathhouses, gardens, private villas and, yes, public latrines, but maintaining this intricate system required skilled labor, public funding, political will, and above all stability. As the empire weakened, so did its infrastructure. The aqueducts themselves didn't always collapse in some dramatic fashion. Many still flowed, but neglect crept in. Channels became clogged with debris. Repairs were delayed. Water pressure dropped. In outlying cities, especially in provinces, like Gaul, North Africa, or Britain, entire stretches of aqueduct were left to decay. Latrines, which relied on flowing water to carry waste and clean sponge sticks, suffered first. In cities like Londinium, Roman London, evidence shows that latrines were repurposed into storage rooms, workshops, or simply abandoned. Waste began to pile up in alleyways again. People reverted to chamber pots and cesspits. The communal pride once tied to the Roman latrine faded. Where water ceased to flow, so did Roman order. An empire of smells. There's a passage in the Historia Augusta, a late Roman biographical text, that mentions the Emperor Elagabalus installing silver pipes for his villa's bathhouse. But even this luxury came at a time when many cities had already begun to experience breakdowns in sanitation. The shift was uneven. Some wealthy cities and families maintained private latrines well into the late empire, but public facilities increasingly fell out of use or became places to avoid. Sanitation is often invisible when it works well, but acutely felt when it doesn't. The smell of decline in ancient cities was as real as the politics behind it. Latrines that once flushed waste down sewer channels now sat stagnant. Mosquitoes bred in the pooled water. Mold grew on the stone. Sponge sticks, if present at all, were reused without proper cleaning. The vinegar solution, a kind of crude disinfectant, was expensive and often absent. Add to this the spiritual changes in Rome during the later centuries. As Christianity grew in influence, public nudity and shared bodily functions became increasingly frowned upon. What was once normal in a Roman latrine, men and women talking openly while using the facilities, was now seen by Christian moralists as indecent. This ideological shift meant that latrines began to lose their place in public life, not just due to infrastructure collapse, but due to changing cultural norms. By the 5th century, even many public bathhouses were being closed or repurposed. The church grew stronger and began promoting modesty and moral separation of the sexes. The toilet, once an extension of Roman engineering brilliance, now became a private, shameful necessity. The sponge becomes a symbol. Let us pause to consider the sponge stick again, so often treated as a footnote in Roman hygiene. The tesseract is more than just an artifact, it is a symbol of Roman practicality. To modern readers, it may seem gross, but it was consistent with Roman thinking. If there is a need, create a reusable, inexpensive, accessible tool to solve it. And yet, by the 4th and 5th centuries, sponge sticks start disappearing from the archaeological record. Latrine sites excavated from this era often lack the water troughs that accompanied them in earlier centuries. There are no holders, no vinegar jars, no channels for rinsing. It's as if the practice was abandoned or quietly forgotten. The sponge stick didn't survive the fall of Rome. Paper would eventually replace it, first in China, much later in Europe. But for centuries, Roman hygiene had revolved around it. Its disappearance marks more than a technological shift. It marks the end of a communal mindset, a society that saw even defecation as something that could be engineered, shared, and managed together. Ruralization and retreat. As the Western Roman Empire contracted, cities emptied, people moved to rural estates or fled into the countryside to escape war, taxation, or famine. The large urban infrastructure that supported public latrines no longer made sense in isolated villas or hilltop forts, and so, the latrine reverted to something older, more primitive, a hole in the ground, a pit, a place to go alone, quickly, without ceremony or chatter. In this way, the collapse of Roman latrines was not dramatic but steady, unceremonious. One day, the water stops flowing. A month later, the sponge stick goes missing. A year later, the stone bench is cracked and ignored. Eventually, it becomes a niche for pottery shards, or a stable for animals. Archaeologists have found several latrine structures in late Roman Britain that were filled with trash layer ceramics, broken tiles, discarded tools suggesting they had been repurposed long before the surrounding building fell. Even the Cloaca Maxima, the grand sewer of Rome, continued to function into the medieval period, but more as a drainage channel than a working sanitation system. By the time the Western Empire formally ended in 476 CE, the era of public Roman toilets had already passed into memory. A legacy, buried in stone. And yet, their footprint remained. Many Roman latrines were buried rather than destroyed. Their benches, pipes, and channels often lie beneath modern cities, found intact by archaeologists. In places like Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, visitors can still sit on the stone benches of ancient toilets, just as Romans did 2,000 years ago. In the ruins of Leptis Magna in Libya or Timgad in Algeria, the latrine structures remain, surprisingly complete right down to the water channels and sponge stick holes. It's in these preserved spaces that we see the Roman attitude toward public life most clearly. Everything was connected, everything was shared. From news to gossip to the sponge stick. Roman engineers believed that public spaces, including latrines, should reflect the order of the empire itself. And so, even in their decay, Roman toilets tell a story of ambition, engineering, culture, and loss. They remind us that the things we take most for granted, clean water, sanitation, shared infrastructure, are not guaranteed. They are the product of planning, labor, and values. When those values fade, even the toilet becomes a symbol of decline. A quiet echo. Picture now a forgotten Roman latrine. The water channel is dry, the basin is cracked, grass grows through the bench holes. Somewhere nearby, a mosaic reads Sali's Per. Acum hell through water. No one visits it now. The chatter is gone. The sponge stick has turned to dust, but the bench is still there, waiting for someone to notice that here, in the most humble of places, Rome once sat side by side, sharing time, space, and silence. From ruins to reverence, what the Roman toilet taught the world. The year is 2025. You sit comfortably in a private bathroom. The plumbing hums softly behind the walls. The toilet flushes with a touch. A roll of soft paper sits beside you, barely noticed. Water flows invisibly pure, pressurized, filtered. You are alone, and you don't think twice about it. But 2,000 years ago, on the marble benches of ancient Rome, this moment, this act was something entirely different. In the final section of our story, we'll explore how the Roman public toilet, humble and often laughed at, became one of history's most enduring symbols of civic function, and what its legacy reveals about society, infrastructure, and the value of what's invisible until it breaks. Public space, public trust. Taught to understand what made the Roman latrine exceptional, we must remember what most of human history looked like without it. In many pre-modern societies, sanitation was a personal, even secret, activity. Waste disposal was an afterthought handled with pits, chamber pots, or open streets. Illnesses spread, smells lingered, cities stank. Yet Rome, beginning in the late Republic and reaching its peak in the early Empire, chose another path. They chose to build public sanitation into public identity. The latrine was a literal and symbolic extension of Roman values. It was part of a broader belief that civitas citizenship meant access to clean water, functioning roads, and civic services. It wasn't just about personal dignity, it was about shared structure. And the latrine demanded trust. Trust that the sponge stick would be cleaned. Trust that the water would flow. Trust that those beside you would follow the same rituals. Trust that the state would maintain it. Modern cities today have restrooms and plumbing, but few of them represent civic pride. For the Romans, public facilities were not less than private ones. In fact, public latrines often had better placement, plumbing, and design than the small personal toilets found in elite villas. Why? Because the Romans understood what many societies forget. A functioning public life depends on invisible systems that everyone uses, but no one sees. The architecture of order. Let's return for a moment to the design of these toilets in cities. Like Ostia Antica, the remains of communal latrines reveal complex systems. Curved benches with up to 20 holes, evenly spaced. Channels for waste removal. Troughs for foot washing. Floors gently sloped for easy drainage. Ventilation built into the walls. Even decorative mosaics and frescoes adorned some of these spaces. Some latrines were attached to bathhouses, allowing users to complete their cleansing routines in one trip. Others stood near markets, theaters, or military barracks. But the unifying principle, function married to elegance. Romans did not treat the toilet as an embarrassment to be hidden in dark corners. They placed them when needed, where visible. Some latrines had inscriptions dedicating them to emperors or local officials who paid for their construction. Others displayed mosaics with sayings, reminders of hygiene, or even gods watching over the act. Yes, even the gods made appearances. The minor deity, Clesina, protector of Rome's sewers, was sometimes invoked near latrines. Offerings were made. Her name was carved into stones. The mundane became sacred, at least symbolically. And the toilet was not outside of divine order, it was part of it. The military latrines, efficiency and equality. In Roman military forts, latrines were essential and democratic. Whether you were a new recruit or a seasoned centurion, when nature called, you sat on the same stone bench. Military latrines were often placed near the barracks and paired with bathhouses. Cleanliness was not just a matter of comfort, it was strategy. Armies lost to disease far more often than they did to swords. Archaeological digs at Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, reveal latrine structures integrated with bath complexes. Latrine waste was flushed into adjacent streams or ditches, sometimes treated with lime to reduce smell. Roman commanders knew, discipline begins with sanitation. What happened after Rome fell? When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, its systems collapsed too. Roads went unmaintained, aqueducts broke, trade routes dissolved, and public sanitation, once a cornerstone of Roman urbanism, faded into history. Europe, now entering the early medieval period, returned to private, rudimentary waste disposal. Chamber pots and cesspits became common again. Waste was thrown into the street. Public toilets disappeared for nearly 1,000 years. In medieval London, for example, open ditches and rivers like the Thames became dumping grounds for human waste. In Paris, household waste laws were passed only to be widely ignored. Plagues spread in part because of poor sanitation. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid haunted cities. The knowledge once embedded in Roman latrines was lost or ignored. Yet, in Islamic cities like Baghdad or Cordoba, echoes of Roman sanitation re-emerged. The Muslim world preserved Greek and Roman texts on engineering and medicine. Public baths, hammams, and toilet areas within mosques continued traditions of cleanliness, showing that not all of Rome's legacy vanished. Still, the grandeur of communal, engineered latrines, clean, social, and integrated was gone. Until modern times. Rediscovery through ruins. The ruins of Roman latrines were rediscovered slowly, in the 18th and 19th centuries, as archaeologists began unearthing cities like Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Ostia. They found not just temples and villas, but toilets. Toilets with intricate water systems. Benches with wear marks from years of use. Mosaic floors still intact. Channels still sloping downward at first. These discoveries were seen as curiosities. Some scholars found them distasteful or irrelevant, but over time they came to be recognized as engineering marvels. The latrine told a different history of Rome, not one of emperors and wars, but of everyday life, of civic values, of how a society cares for its people, even at their most vulnerable and ordinary moments. In modern museum exhibits today, Roman toilets are featured not as jokes, but as models. Engineers and urban planners study them to understand sustainability, water flow, and community design. In a strange twist, what was once lost to time, dismissed as boring, became essential to reimagining the future. The latrine's modern lessons. So what do Roman public toilets teach us now? Lesson 1. Infrastructure is not just wires and pipes, it's trust. The Romans built toilets because they believed in a shared civic life. Every working latrine required cooperation between builders, users, cleaners, and funders. A city that maintains its toilets is one that believes in itself. Lesson 2: Maintenance matters more than innovation. Rome didn't invent toilets, but they maintained and improved them on a massive scale. Their decline didn't begin with destruction, it began when maintenance failed. Lesson 3: The most boring things shape history. Toilets, water, roads, these are not flashy monuments, but they determine health, prosperity, and survival. Every time a Roman latrine was cleaned or flushed, a citizen lived longer, a city functioned better, civilization advanced. Lesson 4: Public doesn't mean inferior. Rome showed that public facilities could be elegant, efficient, and respected. Today's debates over public toilets echo these ancient decisions: where we place restrooms, how we fund them, who uses them. They are all modern versions of Roman conversations. And so we sit again. Back in your modern bathroom, you flush, wash your hands, and return to your day. No fanfare, no graffiti, number, sponge stick. But somewhere beneath a ruined city in Italy or Tunisia, a latrine bench still stands. Water no longer flows beneath it, but the channels remain, the grooves are worn, the troughs still slope downward. And in that silent ruin, a lesson echoes: greatness is built in the details. A civilization is not judged only by its monuments or victories, but by how it handles the most basic human needs, with dignity, with order, and with thought. The Roman public toilet wasn't glamorous, it wasn't poetic, but it worked. And for hundreds of years, it stood as a quiet pillar of what Rome believed: that to be human was to be shared, seen, and supported even while seated on cold stone. Story 3: The Salt Roads. How a craving built empires and moved armies. Sweat, trade, and the silent power of salt. You may not notice it today, sprinkled lightly over your dinner, tucked inside a kitchen cupboard, or flowing through a self-refilling shaker, but salt, ordinary, silent, and dusty white, once carried the weight of empires. It was measured in labor, traded for gold, used to pay soldiers, and hoarded like treasure. Before gold coins gleamed, before oil became king, salt was one of the most valuable commodities on earth. In this story, we walk the roads that salt carved into the earth, across deserts, through jungles, along mountain ridges, and deep beneath the sea. These were the salt roads, veins of civilization, stretching across continents in silence. And our journey begins not in a palace, but in sweat. The body's unspoken need. Salt is essential for life. Without sodium and chloride ions, your nerves don't fire properly, your muscles cramp, your cells malfunction. In ancient climates, hot, dry, brutal humans sweated out this precious mineral with every step. Laborers, farmers, soldiers, even priests lost salt in the heat of the sun, and without a way to replace it, they grew weak. This made salt not just a luxury, but a necessity. Early humans understood this instinctively. Animals would lick rocks, or soil where natural salt deposits existed. People followed. Where there was salt, there was settlement. Where there was none, there was migration. In the Neolithic era, people began boiling brine from salty springs. In time, they learned to mine rock salt directly from underground deposits. But once salt could be extracted, it had to move. Hence, the salt roads. The birth of salt routes. Long before Rome or Babylon, there were salt trails. Archaeologists have traced salt trade routes dating back over 8,000 years. In what is now Austria, salt miners in the Hallstatt region dug deep into the Alps to extract pink-hued salt, some of the earliest organized mining efforts in human history. And across Africa, the Sahara shimmered with hidden paths carved by camels and traders who carried heavy salt slabs across vast sands to exchange them for gold, grain, and textiles. But perhaps no civilization elevated salt to such quiet power as ancient China. As early as 2000 BCE, Chinese emperors controlled salt production through state monopolies. Brine wells were dug by hand. Bamboo pipelines, hundreds of miles long, carried the brine to evaporation centers. The knowledge of salt extraction became a state secret. In fact, some of the earliest drilling techniques used to find natural gas were invented during the salt extraction process. In imperial China, salt was used as currency. Families paid their taxes in salt. Entire rebellions, like the Salt Gabelle Revolt, during the Tang dynasty, erupted over taxation and control of salt supplies. Salt, to the Chinese, was not just food, it was finance. And this leads us to another civilization, Rome, an empire. Built on salt roads, you might think of Rome as built by swords and aqueducts. But beneath its shining stones ran something less glamorous and equally powerful: salt routes. The Via Salaria, literally, the Salt Road, was one of the earliest and most critical Roman roads. Stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the heart of Rome, it allowed salt from coastal flats to be transported inland. This road predated many of Rome's conquests and helped feed a growing population long before the Republic dreamed of an empire. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given salt allowances, a practice from which we derive the word salary. From Latin salarium, to be worth your salt meant you earned your keep. Salt was used to preserve meat, fish, and vegetables, giving Rome's armies the ability to march long distances without relying on daily harvests. Without salt, there was no preserved food. Without preserved food, there were no long campaigns. Without campaigns, there was no empire. Salt was, quite literally, Rome's marching powder. The salt trade was so central to Rome's strategy that controlling salt sources became a justification for conquest. Seizing a rival's salt works was not only a blow to their economy, it was a weapon of control. And even within Rome itself, public officials regulated salt prices and purity. The Portus Romae, Rome's ancient port, processed thousands of amphierae of salted fish, pickled vegetables, and salted meats. Salt was both the ingredient and the preservative of empire. North Africa and the salt gold trade. While Rome managed roads and regulations, West Africa built an empire on a trade that was measured by weight-for-weight. In the medieval kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, salt was exchanged for gold, sometimes literally one slab for one nugget. Why? Because salt was scarce in the rainforest interiors of West Africa, but abundant in the Sahara. Meanwhile, gold was plentiful in the forested zones but worthless without salt to preserve food and maintain health. So camels marched, bearing enormous salt blocks cut from mines in Tagaza and Taudani, hundreds of miles across dunes. These salt caravans were epic journeys, often lasting months, and guided by oral tradition and starlight. At night, travelers slept beside their cargo. By day, they watched for mirages and thieves. The caravans could stretch for miles. Each camel might carry 300 pounds of salt. Entire towns along the route existed solely to support this trade. When the salt arrived, it was stacked, weighed, examined, and bartered. Sometimes it was literally consumed as currency bitten to ensure purity. The chunks were then broken down, distributed, and stored in clay jars. Salt was not only traded, it was defended. Raids on salt caravans were common, and controlling access to the salt roads was one reason Timbuktu and Gao became centers of wealth, learning, and culture. The hidden cost of salt. While salt fed empires, it also enslaved. In many parts of the world, salt mining was brutally labor. In some Chinese brine fields, salt workers were bound to their profession for life and able to leave, generation after generation. In West Africa, enslaved people were used to extract salt from the harshest regions. The mines of Taudani were so dangerous that people often lived there only seasonally. Prisoners and forced laborers worked in choking heat and blinding salt dust, their skin cracked, their lungs filled with crystals. In Europe, medieval salt. In France and Germany used convicts or serfs. In Austria, children as young as 10 worked in damp, dark tunnels, dragging sledges of rock salt. Salt's power was never purely economic. It came at a human cost. Every road, every caravan, every pinch of the white crystal carried stories of sweat and suffering. And yet, the world moved. Despite its weight, its dangers, its slow movement, salt remained the silent engine of civilization. It preserved fish in Scandinavia. It hardened cheese in the Alps. It cured olives in Greece. It brined cabbage into kimchi in Korea. And wherever it moved, salt shaped the roads, the cities, the diet, and the economies that followed. By the time industrial salt production took off in the 19th century using mechanized drills, pumps, and evaporators, ancient salt roads had mostly faded, but their legacy remained. You can still walk sections of the Via Salaria in Italy today. You can visit the salt mines of Holstedt in Austria and see Bronze Age tools left behind. You can travel to Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, where salt was carved into chapels and statues, and in Africa, in places like Bilma and Taudini, salt caravans still cross the desert Fua now, slower but echoing the past with each creaking step, a grain of civilization. So the next time you reach for the salt shaker, pause. Consider how this small mineral, so basic, so bland, once shaped the map. Consider the thousands of miles it moved, the labor it demanded, the wealth it created, the suffering it masked. the meals it preserved, the roads it carved out. And consider this final thought. If something as silent as salt could move empires, what other invisible forces might still be shaping our world today? Salt taxes, uprisings, and the slow burn of revolution. In the first section, we explored salt as a foundational commodity vital to the body, essential for preservation, and central to ancient economies. It built roads, funded armies, and turned desert caravans into lifelines of trade. But salt's story doesn't end with empire. In this section, we journey into the era when salt stopped being a quiet servant of civilization and became something else entirely, a weapon, a symbol, and a spark for rebellion. By the medieval and early modern periods, governments had begun to see salt not just as a staple good but as a taxable one, and once states learned they could control salt's production, sale, and price, they rarely gave that power up. Salt became a source of state revenue and, eventually, a source of fury. The gabelle, France's salty curse. Let's begin in France. During the 14th century, the French monarchy instituted a salt tax known as the gabelle. At first, it was a temporary measure used to raise money for wars and royal expenses. But as the monarchy grew more indebted, the gabelle became permanent. It wasn't just a tax, it was a system of control. Under the gabelle, the French people were required to buy a minimum amount of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. The state controlled the salt mines. Private merchants were outlawed. Even storing or transporting untaxed salt was a crime. The system was cruelly unequal. France was divided into gabelle regions. Some paid high prices, others paid none at all. If you lived in one of the high-tax areas such as Brittany or Provence, you paid more than 30 times the rate of those in the exempt zones. This disparity bred resentment, especially among the poor who depended on salt to preserve food and care for livestock. Salt smuggling became widespread. Fauconniers, illegal salt traders, rose up across the countryside, sneaking salt in barrels, sacks, even sewn into clothing. Caught smugglers could face prison, fines, or death. In some years, thousands were jailed over salt. The gabelle endured for centuries, hated by peasants, lampooned by pamphleteers, and condemned by Enlightenment thinkers. And then came the spark, the French Revolution. When the revolution began in 1789, one of the first demands of the National Assembly was to abolish the gabelle. To the revolutionaries, salt taxes represented everything wrong with the Ancien regime: oppression, greed, and bureaucratic cruelty. And when the revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, they weren't just after weapons. Many of them were angry over food prices, and salt was part of that anger. The gabelle was formally abolished in 1790, and for a while France breathed free. But only for a while. In 1806, under Napoleon, the salt tax was quietly reinstated. His empire needed funds for war, and salt, as always, was reliable. The gabelle returned. It remained in force through multiple regimes, revolutions, and governments not officially repealed until 1946. Yes, 1946. Salt, it seems, is hard to let go. India, the salt march to freedom. More than a century after the French Revolution, salt would ignite another, quieter rebellion. On the other side of the world, India, under British colonial rule in the 19th and early 20th centuries, was subject to heavy salt taxation. Although India had a vast coastline and natural salt flats, the British Empire enforced a monopoly on all salt production and sales. Private harvesting was outlawed. Indian citizens had to buy British salt, often imported from abroad, at inflated prices. It was another layer of control, another way the colonial power drained wealth from the colonized. Then came Mahatma Gandhi in 1930. Gandhi chose salt as the battleground for civil disobedience. His logic was brilliant. Salt was a necessity for every Indian, rich or poor. Unlike abstract constitutional rights or political debates, salt was intimate. You needed it to survive. Gandhi's Salt March began on March 12, 1930. He and a small group of followers walked 240 miles from his ashram to the coastal town of Dandi. There, on April 6, Gandhi waded into the sea and illegally made salt by evaporating seawater. It was a simple gesture, and it shook an empire. Tens of thousands followed. They harvested salt from the sea, bought and sold it illegally, and refused to pay the tax. British authorities arrested over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. But the world was watching. Newsreels, photographs, and articles showed the quiet dignity of Indians resisting colonial rule over something as humble as salt. It was one of the first globally recognized acts of mass non-violent resistance, and it worked. Although the salt laws themselves were not repealed immediately, the Salt March changed public opinion both in India and abroad. It exposed the cruelty of empire and inspired later civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., to adopt non-violent protests as a strategy. Salt, once again, became more than a mineral. It became a banner. America, war, preservation, and the Civil War salt crisis. Even the United States, in its own young history, has known salt shortages and conflict. During the American Civil War, salt became a critical resource for both the Union and the Confederacy. Why? Because armies depended on salt to preserve meat. Without refrigeration, feeding thousands of troops meant brining or salting everything. The Confederacy, cut off from major salt supplies, faced a dire crisis. Salt works in Saltville, Virginia, and along the Gulf Coast became strategic targets. Union forces launched raids to destroy these sites. At one point, Confederate President Jefferson Davis said, "Next to gunpowder and lead, salt is the greatest necessity." Salt was also a key issue for civilians. Southern families struggled to preserve food without it. Salt prices skyrocketed. In Georgia, salt riots broke out. Families would boil down soil from salt springs to collect residue. Even after the war, salt remained crucial in industrial America for tanning, curing, chemical production, and cattle ranching. The Great Lakes became salt-producing hubs. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Syracuse were built around underground salt beds. Salt no longer caused revolutions, but it still shaped economies. The end of the monopoly. So why did salt lose its power? The answer lies in technology. With the rise of mechanized mining, refrigeration, and chemical preservatives, was no longer the only way to keep food edible. It became one of many ingredients useful but not irreplaceable. At the same time, governments shifted. Modern states began relying more on income taxes, tariffs, and corporate revenue, and less on commodity monopolies. Salt, once taxed in nearly every empire, became cheap, widely available, and quietly forgotten. And yet, its legacy lingers. Salt taxes helped fund the Great Wall of China. Salt roads led to Roman conquest. Salt caravans shaped African geography. Salt protests sparked Indian independence. Salt shortages shaped American war strategy. In almost every era, salt has left footprints, quiet, grainy, and lasting. Salt today, quiet, omnipresent, essential. Today, salt is everywhere and nowhere. It's mined by giant machines, harvested by solar evaporation, and added to nearly every processed food. It keeps roads safe in winter. It softens water. It seasons dinner. It's in our blood and in our oceans. But its story is no longer one of rebellion or monopoly. It's a story of invisibility. Salt is now so cheap, so common, that we forget its history. The same mineral that once cost gold now costs pennies. And yet, the salt roads are still there, fossilized in trade routes, borderlines, city maps, and culinary habits. Every time you open a bag of potato chips, sprinkle sea salt on a tomato, or cure a slice of fish, you're participating in a ritual that stretches back 10,000 years. A ritual of survival, control, rebellion, and taste. Sacred crystals, secret codes, and salt in the soul of civilization. By now, we've walked the salt roads from ancient brine fields and desert caravans to tax revolts and marches for independence. We've seen how salt built economies, fed armies, and triggered rebellion. But salt's story doesn't end with trade or taxes. In this final section, we step beyond the physical into the spiritual, the symbolic, and the cultural. Because salt has always been more than just a substance. It is a metaphor, a covenant, a ritual, and a reminder that even the plainest things can carry the deepest meanings. Salt lives not just in the ground, but in language, religion, myth, and memory. Salt and the sacred. In nearly every ancient religion, salt was a sacred element. Why? Because it preserved life, it purified, it prevented decay, it endured. Salt was incorruptibly immune to time and rotted in a world where most food spoiled quickly. This seemed almost miraculous. In the Hebrew Bible, salt appears often. God commands that every grain offering be seasoned with salt, calling it a covenant of salt, Leviticus 23. The phrase symbolized permanence and faithfulness. A covenant sealed with salt was one that could not be broken. In ancient Judaism, newborns were rubbed with salt to purify them. In some interpretations, Lot's wife turning into a pillar of Salt wasn't just punishment, it was a transformation into something eternal and untouched by corruption. The Greeks and Romans also associated salt with purity and sacrifice. Salt was thrown onto the flames during offerings to the gods. It cracked and hissed as it burned, sending a visible sign of reverence into the air. In Hinduism, salt remains part of funeral rites. It's used to purify the body and the space where death occurred. It's also seen as a spiritual cleanser during ceremonies, believed to ward off evil or unclean energies. Even in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad is said to have begun and ended his meals with a pinch of salt, linking it to modesty and spiritual balance. Across cultures, salt was used to bless, protect, and preserve not just food, but the soul. Language and the legacy of salt. Salt also lives in our words. Have you ever described someone as the salt of the earth? That phrase comes from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." It's a way of saying, you are essential, grounding, incorruptible, quietly good. To eat someone's salt, in ancient Arabic and Persian idioms, meant to share hospitality, to become bound in loyalty. Even today in parts of Central Asia, to betray the salt is to commit a deep moral offense. The English word salary comes from salarium, the money paid to Roman soldiers sometimes as a salt allowance. Though scholars debate whether soldiers were literally paid in salt, the connection is linguistically and symbolically powerful. Think of other expressions. Worth your salt, meaning competent or deserving. Salty, now slang for irritability, but once meant pungent, strong, distinct. Take it with a grain of salt, from Latin cum grano solus, meaning with skepticism or caution. Salt's linguistic trail is long and layered, quietly woven into the way we speak and think about value, trust, and truth. Salt as division and bond. Salt can unite, but it can also divide. In ancient cultures, salt was often seen as a boundary. In China, the salt frontier was where civilization ended and the unknown began. The state guarded salt rights closely, and illegal salt merchants were punished severely, not just for tax evasion, but for crossing political and social lines. In medieval Europe, salt lines shaped borders. Some cities rose to power because they controlled nearby salt pans. Others faded into obscurity without access to saline springs. In Japan, the ritual of scattering salt is still used to purify doorways or prepare sumo rings. But salt is also used symbolically to exclude. If a guest brings dishonor, some hosts sprinkle salt behind them as they leave, an act of subtle, silent rejection. Thus, salt becomes both a gesture of welcome and a sign of boundary, you could say. Salt is the mineral form of trust, superstition, magic, and the invisible. As belief systems evolved, salt kept its spiritual weight. In European folklore, salt was believed to repel evil. Witches were thought to fear it. Demons avoided it. A circle of salt could trap a spirit, ward off bad dreams, or cleanse a haunted space. In Russia and Eastern Europe, salt and bread are offered to guests as a sign of deep respect. In many cultures, salt is still placed in corners of the home, or carried on one's person for protection. And then there's the superstition. Spilling salt brings bad luck. Where did this come from? One theory traces it to Leonardo da Vinci's painting The Last Supper, where Judas Iscariot is shown knocking over a salt cellar. Since Judas was the betrayer, the act of spilling salt became associated with misfortune. The cure: toss a pinch of it over your left shoulder to blind the devil waiting there. It sounds irrational, but for centuries salt was life itself. Losing it wasn't just clumsy, it was symbolic of spiritual or communal rupture, culinary identity, and cultural memory. Let's step briefly into the kitchen. Every culture has its own salt story in food. From the Roman garama, fermented fish sauce packed with salt, to miso in Japan, soy sauce in China, anchovy paste in Italy, and bagong in the Philippines. Salt has been the alchemist's tool in kitchens worldwide. That it preserves, yes, but it also transforms. It deepens flavor, it enhances sweetness, it balances bitterness. A good chef knows salt isn't just seasoning, it's structure. In fact, many culinary traditions define themselves through how they use salt. In Scandinavia, salted fish like herring and cod form the backbone of traditional diets. In Korea, salt is vital to kimchi and gochujang. In India, black salt kala namak is prized for its sulfurous depth. In Mexico, salt is paired with chili and lime, not just for flavor, but for ritual. In Ethiopia, salt tablets were once traded like money and still carry cultural weight. These practices are more than habit. They're forms of cultural memory. They trace the paths of trade, migration, and preservation. They echo the ancient salt roads, reimagined as recipes. Salt and the body. A modern relationship. Today, our relationship with salt is complicated. We are told to limit it, fearing hypertension and heart disease. Processed foods overflow with it. Health labels warn us in bold letters. Salt, once rare and precious, is now so abundant that it's almost dangerous. But the truth is, we still need it. It's just imbalanced. Our bodies can't function without sodium. Athletes take electrolyte supplements. Medical IVs deliver saline in emergencies. Dehydration is often treated not with plain water but with salt and sugar solutions. The irony. For millennia, humans traveled hundreds of miles for a taste of salt. Today, we spend billions trying to remove it from our diets. What changed wasn't salt but us. We industrialized, overprocessed, and overconsumed. And like every great resource, salt reminds us that excess can be as harmful as scarcity. The final grain. Salt is easy to overlook. It disappears into food. It hides in the ocean. It gathers silently in lakes and mines. And yet its story touches every corner of history. Salt fed empires, sparked wars, funded roads, inspired rebellion, shaped language, blessed rituals, protected homes, and still sits, quietly, in your kitchen. So the next time you reach for it, pause. See the caravan in the desert, the Roman soldier on the Via Salaria, the French peasant counting coins, the Indian marcher at the sea, the grandmother preserving cabbage, the newborn rubbed in sacred crystals, the monk chanting over a flame. All of them, connected by this small, silent, essential mineral. Story 4. Medieval candlemakers, the wax, the tallow, and the stench of devotion. In the glow of Greece, how medieval Europe was lit one drip at a time. Picture yourself in a stone room in a medieval village. The fire in the hearth has burned low. Outside, the sun has long set. There are no light switches, no street lamps, no digital glow. The only thing between you and complete darkness is a candle. Its flame is small, its reach limited, but it is precious. It hisses slightly, flickers with every breath of wind, and smells faintly of animals or, sometimes, of honey. And behind that single candle lies a network of labor, trade, religion, and stink that kept the Middle Ages dimly but steadily lit. This is the story of medieval candlemakers. It's not the tale of knights or kings, but of the people who scraped fat from butchered oxen, boiled tallow in bubbling cauldrons, dipped and dipped again, and lit the darkness for prayers, suppers, and secrets. Let us walk into the quiet, greasy corners of medieval life where light was a luxury, and those who made it rarely saw glory. A world before brightness, before electricity. The world was governed by the sun. When the sun rose, work began. When it set, everything slowed. People went to bed earlier. Meals were simpler at night. Reading was rare unless you were wealthy or clergy. Most homes were lit only by the hearth or, if fortunate, a candle or two. But candles were expensive in early medieval Europe. The average peasant family could not afford to burn candles regularly. Many relied on rushlights, a more humble alternative, made by soaking the dried pith of a rush plant in animal fat. These burned poorly, smoked heavily, and had to be replaced often. For those who could afford better, two main types of candles lit the world. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, cheap, common, and terribly smelly. Beeswax candles, made from the honeycomb, cleaner, brighter, and highly prized. Each had its own story, each had its own economy, and each had its own maker. Tallow, the greasy backbone of light. Tallow is rendered from animal fat, usually from cows, sheep, or pigs. In the slaughterhouses and butcher shops of medieval towns, fat was collected as a byproduct of meat production. Leftover scraps were boiled and strained, and what emerged was a thick, waxy grease. Candlemakers known as chandlers would heat this fat in large cauldrons. The smell was unmistakable, sour, heavy, and persistent. Tallow chandlers were often forced to work in specific parts of town, downwind, because the stench offended neighbors. To make a candle, a cotton or flax wick was tied to a wooden rod. It was dipped into the hot tallow, lifted, cooled, and dipped again dozens of times until the desired thickness was reached. This was not a glamorous job. The work was hot, smelly, and repetitive. Tallow cooled quickly in cold weather, making winter a difficult season. Flies and rodents were constant visitors. Chandlers risked burns, blisters, and lung irritation. But tallow candles were essential. They were used in taverns, workshops, peasant homes, and even some monasteries. Their light was dim and smoky, but dependable. They sputtered, they bent in heat, they needed constant trimming, but they were cheap enough for daily use, at least for the slightly better off. Some households made their own tallow candles, rendering fat from home-killed animals in small batches. In rural areas, this was a family trovathon assigned to women and children. Tallow was light for the many, but it came at a cost not of money, but of smell, labor, and dignity. Beeswax, the candle of the sacred and the rich. In contrast stood beeswax, candles made from the honeycombs of domesticated bees. Beeswax required a different kind of economy, one tied to apiaries, careful harvesting, and a good deal of patience. Beeswax burned cleaner, brighter, and longer than tallow. It gave off a pleasant, sweet smell. It produced far less smoke, but it was far more expensive. A single beeswax candle could cost 10 times as much as a tallow one. For this reason, beeswax candles were typically reserved for churches and monasteries, nobility and wealthy merchants, ceremonial occasions like weddings, funerals, and feast days. The church, in particular, became a major consumer of beeswax. Candles were needed for masses, vigils, and processions. Light held symbolic meaning representing purity, the presence of God, the soul's journey. Tallow was considered too impure for sacred spaces. In large cathedrals, hundreds of beeswax candles could be burned in a single ceremony. Monasteries often kept their own hives. Monks would tend to bees not just for honey, but to harvest wax for sacred light. Beeswax candles were dipped or molded, depending on the scale. The process was delicate. Impurities had to be strained. Too much heat, and the wax would darken. Too little, and it would clump. Owning or using beeswax was a status symbol. A guest arriving at a manor lit with beeswax candles knew instantly. This was wealth. This was power. But for most, it remained out of reach. The chandler's place in town. Candle makers were not seen as high artisans, yet they played a crucial role in medieval towns. In larger cities, chandlers formed guilds, setting prices, training apprentices, and regulating quality. They were often separate from other trades, as well there's especially butchers, though their materials overlapped. Guild rules sometimes banned chandlers from storing too much tallow indoors, lest fires or infestation occur. Chandlers had to balance multiple roles: supplier to households and merchants. Contractor for churches and abbeys, craftsman of seasonal or custom candle orders, trader of tallow wick and wax materials. They might also sell soap, which was also made from fat and lye. In fact, some chandlers shifted between soap and candle production depending on the season and demand, but the work remained thankless. The candle was consumed quickly, the labor behind it forgotten, and few chandlers rose to prominence. They were connected to wealthy patrons or church contracts. Still, without them, the town would have gone dark. Candles and daily life. Let's step inside a medieval home again. Dinner is served before sunset. The hearth glows, but as the sun sets, in winter, someone reaches for a candle. If it's a tallow candle, it smokes. It must be placed in a metal or clay holder. The flame flickers with drafts. The children sit close to it, reading or sewing. The adults save it only for necessity. Each inch burned is money spent. If it's a beeswax candle, well, you're likely in a different kind of home. The light is steadier. There is less smoke. The air smells faintly of honey and wood polish. Perhaps a scribe copies a manuscript. Perhaps a noblewoman embroiders. But even here, the candle is not taken for granted. In both cases, the candle becomes a clock. A 6-inch candle might burn for 3 hours. A marked candle might be used to measure the hours of the night. In monasteries, monks rose at fixed times to chant prayers, using candles to track the intervals. The candle was time, warmth, safety, and order. And behind everyone was a chandler, standing over a pot of boiling fat or wax, turning the night into day, one layer at a time. From wax to wicks to wages, the long fade of the medieval candle maker. So far we've wandered through greasy workshops and holy sanctuaries, examined flickering lights in courtrooms and cottages, and watched candles burn not only for illumination but for faith, justice, and protection. But the story of candle making, especially that of the medieval chandler, was not destined to remain unchanged. In this final section, we trace how candle making evolved, how chandlers coped with the march of progress, and how the humble candle, once sacred and expensive, became ordinary. The candlemaker, who once worked in darkness to light the world, was about to be pushed aside by forces far brighter and far colder. A slow revolution, changes in wax, wicks, and materials. The medieval chandler's world was shaped by two key ingredients, tallow and beeswax. But from the 15th century onward, new substances began to enter the picture. One of the first major alternatives was spermaceti, a waxy substance obtained from the head cavity of sperm whales. By the 17th century, whaling had become a profitable and increasingly industrialized activity, particularly in New England. Spermaceti had many advantages. It burned brighter and cleaner than tallow, that it was odorless. Unlike animal fat, it produced a firmer, longer-lasting candle. Spermaceti candles quickly became the preferred lighting source for wealthier urban households. Although expensive, they didn't melt in the summer heat like tallow and didn't require trimming or constant attention. The arrival of new wick designs also made candles more efficient. Medieval wicks had to be trimmed constantly to avoid smoke and uneven burning. But in the 18th century, braided cotton wicks were introduced. These curved into the flame as they burned, self-consuming and reducing the need for maintenance. Finally, by the early 19th century, the invention of paraffin wax, derived from coal and later petroleum, transformed the candle into an industrial product. Cheap, clean burning, and easy to mold, paraffin quickly outpaced traditional waxes in volume and cost, and with these changes, the medieval chandler's world began to fade, chandlers and guilds in decline. In medieval cities, candle makers belonged to two tightly organized guilds. These groups regulated training, prices, materials, and territory. Becoming a master chandler required years of apprenticeship, followed by the production of a masterpiece, often a perfect taper or molded candle. Guilds had power. They protected their members, negotiated with the church and city officials, and policed quality. They issued fines for impure wax or poor workmanship. Some even sponsored religious events and festivals, parading through the streets behind giant wax effigies. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, that control began to weaken. State centralization, urban expansion, and new markets undermined traditional guild monopolies. In England, the rise of the free market and the repeal of many guild restrictions during the Reformation era allowed independent candle sellers and manufacturers to flourish. In France, the revolution dissolved guilds entirely. Across Europe, the rise of capitalism and industrial manufacturing meant that candle production was no longer the domain of individual craftsmen but of companies, factories, and mass production. Many chandlers adapted by shifting into soap making, which had overlapping tools and ingredients. Others tried to specialize, focusing on ceremonial or luxury candles, but the days of the neighborhood wax shop were numbered. From tallow pot to factory mold, the profession became mechanized, lighting the cities, gas and electricity. Even before the electric bulb, the candle was losing its dominance. By the early 1800s, gas lighting began to appear in cities like London and Paris. Streets were lined with gas lamps, homes fitted with fixtures that could be lit with a simple match. No dipping, no trimming, no dripping wax on your robes. Candles, once a luxury, became a backup. Then, in 1879, Thomas Edison unveiled the first practical electric light bulb. Within a few decades, electricity became widespread in urban areas. Entire buildings could be lit by the flip of a switch. Night no longer meant darkness. This technological shift was perhaps the greatest threat to candle making. What centuries of war, plague, and empire couldn't destroy, the light bulb did, in a matter of decades. Candles were no longer needed. They were now nostalgic. The candle's afterlife, ritual, romance, and scented wax. But the candle did not disappear. Instead, it was reborn not as necessity, but as symbol. Even today, candles remain religious objects, lit in churches, synagogues, temples, and home altars. Ceremonial tools, used at weddings, funerals, vigils, and birthdays. Decorative items, providing ambience, aroma, and warmth. Luxury products, now sold in ornate jars with scents like sandalwood, lavender, or smoked cedar. In some traditions, candles have even returned to prominence. In Orthodox Christianity, beeswax candles are still made by hand and used in liturgy. In Judaism, Shabbat candles are lit weekly. In Catholicism, votive candles flicker in red glass holders beside statues and altars. And across secular cultures, candles symbolize everything from romance to grief. We light them when we fall in love, when we mourn, when we meditate, when we mark anniversaries. Their flame signals presence, even in absence. It is telling that during power outages, many people instinctively reach for candles, not just for light, but for comfort. The candle has outlived its usefulness by becoming meaningful. The modern chandler, hobbyist and artisan today, chandlery is no longer a common profession, but it has experienced a quiet resurgence in artisan markets, online shops, and cottage industries. Small-scale candle makers craft hand-poured soy candles, beeswax tapers made with traditional dipping methods, sculptural or scented, candles in elaborate molds, ritual candles for spiritual or magical use. Some even revive medieval techniques, boiling beeswax in cauldrons, adding essential oils, dipping by hand. Workshops and candle-making classes are popular in historic towns and heritage museums. In these spaces, the old trade becomes educational performance, a way to connect with the past through tactile experience. The modern chandler is often not a tradesman, but a storyteller offering you a candle that smells like a forest after rain or a Victorian bookshop, evoking emotion and memory through fragrance and flame. In a strange way, we've come full circle. Where once a candle held spiritual meaning through ritual, now it holds personal meaning through nostalgia. We light them not to see better, but to feel better. A candle's time. If we step back, we can see how much the candle reveals about us. It reveals how we once lived with darkness pressing in after sunset, with flickers of light marking the passage of time. It reveals how we once believed with candles offered as prayers, as penance, as protection. It reveals how we once worked with hands dipped in boiling fat, weeks spent preparing for one feast day, arms tired from lifting and dipping a dozen times over. It reveals how we've changed with electricity now, banishing night, with scent and color replacing function. But most of all, the candle reminds us of something essential, that light, no matter how small, has always mattered. From the monk copying scripture in a cold cell to the mother lighting a taper in a storm. From the chandler shaping wax by hand to the parishioner placing a votive before a saint. From the wedding aisle to the birthday cake. The candle has marked our joys, our griefs, our faiths, and our hours. Its wax may melt, its wick may vanish, but its story, like its flame, lingers. Story 5. Bread and Bureaucracy. How Grain Records Built Ancient Egypt. Measuring wheat by the moon. The scribal lives behind the pyramids. When we think of ancient Egypt, we imagine golden sarcophagi, towering pyramids, and gods with falcon heads. But behind the grandeur and mysticism was a much quieter foundation. Grain fed the builders of pyramids. It paid priests, soldiers, and scribes. It filled granaries, settled debts, and anchored the economy for thousands of years. And tracking every sack of it, every handful, were the unsung clerks of the Nile, the scribes. These weren't kings, nor warriors. They didn't leave behind monuments, but rather rows of symbols on papyrus, inked in careful lines. They were bureaucrats, record keepers, calendar watchers, and thanks to them, ancient Egypt flourished for over 3,000 years. This is the story of grain, not as food, but as system, and of the quiet, boring genius of Egyptian scribes, whose obsession with measurement turned wheat into power. The Nile, the flood, and the gift of silt. To understand ancient Egypt, we must start with the Nile River. Every year, from around June to September, it flooded. The water rose from Central Africa, overflowed its banks, and left behind a blanket of black, silt-rich in nutrients and perfect for growing crops, especially emmer, wheat, and barley. Without the flood, there would be no agriculture in Egypt. Without agriculture, no pharaohs, no temples, no writing. So, early Egyptian life developed around a rhythm, flooding Akit fields submerged, planting puree, sowing grain into wet soil. Harvest shamu, collecting the golden crop under a dry sun. Each year's harvest depended on the height of the Nile flood. Too low and crops would fail. Too high and homes would drown. The Egyptians developed staircases or wells to measure the flood's rise. These were watched by priests, and the data passed to scribes. Why? Because grain wasn't just food. It was currency. Grain as wealth, wages, and tax. In ancient Egypt, there was no coin money for most of its history. Wheat and barley were the primary mediums of exchange. A worker's wage might be 5 to 10 sacks of grain per month. A temple's income was measured in bushels. A bride's dowry could be paid in sheaves of wheat. Taxes were collected in grain, stored in vast granaries overseen by temple and palace officials. These structures, cooled, sealed, and guarded, acted like state banks. If a region produced extra grain, it could be stored for lean years or redistributed. And overseeing this entire grain-based economy was a vast scribal class educated in mathematics, writing, calendar keeping, and surveying. A good scribe didn't just know how to write a receipt. He had to calculate land yields, estimate flood outcomes, and track thousands of transactions. In a very real sense, scribes were accountants. But unlike modern accountants, their tools weren't spreadsheets. They used papyrus scrolls, reed pens, and a number system based on repeated symbols. They counted not in dollars, but in loaves. Who were the scribes? Scribes were usually male, trained from boyhood in special schools attached to temples or government offices. These schools taught hieratic scripture, simplified version of hieroglyphs used for daily records. Becoming a scribe meant avoiding the hardest forms of labor. It was a middle-class career path, respected but not elite. A scribe might work for a temple, recording offerings, a tax office, calculating yields, a construction crew, managing wages, a noble household, tracking accounts, a Haguenot governor, organizing harvests. The famous satire of the trades, a scribal training text, paints other jobs as miserable. The laundryman stinks, the fisherman drowns, the soldier bleeds. But the scribe, he writes, be a scribe. The text pleads, for it is greater than all other professions. Still, the job was not always glamorous. Many scribes worked in hot storehouses or on long journeys upriver to audit village yields. They dealt with angry farmers, moldy grain, and endless calculations. And yet, their work allowed the kingdom to function. A day in the life, from field to tablet. Let's follow a fictional scribe, named Beck. On a typical day, Beck wakes before dawn. In Thebes, summoned by the rising sun and the scent of baking barley bread, he dons a linen kilt, picks up his writing case complete with reed pens, red and black ink cakes, and a folding wooden pallet, and boards a small boat headed upriver. Today, Beck is visiting several villages to audit grain stores. At each stop, he meets with a local official. They unseal the granary and count the sacks. Beck asks, how many acres were planted? What was the flood level this year? Were there locusts? Did the harvest match last year's? He jots down figures on a scrap of papyrus. Sometimes, he writes in astrakar shards of broken pottery used as notepads. He compares the numbers to last year's data. If something doesn't match, he'll mark the discrepancy and perhaps recommend a tax reduction or a fine. By sunset, Beck is tired. His fingers are stained black with ink. He returns to his office and files his copy for the temple, another for the palace. Then he eats dinner, a bowl of lentils and a slice of date cake, paid for with his monthly grain allowance. It's not glory, but it's secure. Measuring time by the moon and loaf. Scribes didn't just track grain, they also tracked time. The Egyptian calendar was one of the earliest and most accurate in the ancient world. It was based on lunar cycles, seasonal stars, and the annual Nile flood. Months had 30 days, divided into 3 weeks of 10 days. A 360-day year was rounded up to 365, by adding 5 festival days. These measurements weren't just theoretical, they determined planting seasons, tax schedules, and religious ceremonies. Temples employed specialist scribes, known as hour watchers, to track the night sky, ensuring that rituals occurred at the correct times. These scribes also maintained star clocks and helped predict the timing of floods. For ordinary citizens, however, time was often measured in more tactile ways. I'll return in 2 loaves. The work will take half a sack's time. You owe me for 3 moons' harvests. Grain and time were deeply intertwined, one measured life space, the other its sustenance. Bureaucracy and the birth of history. Egypt's obsession with grain records gave rise to something unexpected. History itself. Many of our earliest written texts are not poetry or myths but inventories, lists of offerings, accounts of temple livestock, shipment logs. These dull documents, preserved in tombs and temples, tell us more about ancient daily life than grand statues or battle carvings. One papyrus details a delivery of 523 sacks of barley to a temple. Another records worker absences. At a construction site, Khonsu was sick, Horemheb had diarrhea, Senefer went to bury his wife. These snippets offer a humanity often lost in grand narratives. They show a civilization not just of gods and kings, but of systems, tasks, and people who kept things running. And at the heart of it all was the scribe. Granaries, famines, and the grain that saved or starved a kingdom. In the first section, we saw how scribes in ancient Egypt recorded grain harvests with meticulous care, but their role went beyond ink and scrolls. They didn't just track the flow of wheat and barley, they managed the pulse of the kingdom. This section explores how grain was stored, protected, and sometimes withheld. We'll walk into the cool, dark granaries of ancient towns, peer into clay jars sealed for years, and follow the movement of food from village to palace. We'll also meet famine, that lurking threat that haunted Egypt every season. Because if the flood failed, if the grain ran out, the entire kingdom could unravel. And in those moments, scribes and officials became not just administrators, but saviors or villains. The state granaries, Egypt's lifeline. Across ancient Egypt stood rows of granaries. Public and temple-owned buildings used to store grain. These weren't just barns or silos, they were monumental, often cylindrical structures made of mud brick with high walls, narrow staircases, and thick wooden doors. Inside, grain was stored in large jars, baskets, or directly in the sealed chambers. Some granaries held enough food to feed thousands, others were smaller, serving local communities. Many temples had their own granaries, often supplied by taxes and offerings. Why so many granaries? Because grain spoils, it molds, it attracts rats. It needs to be stored dry, cool, and protected from pests and thieves. The Nile's rhythm meant that harvests came once a year, so a surplus in one season had to last until the next. The granary was not only a warehouse, it was a bank, pantry, and insurance policy all in one. And each was managed by scribes. The scribe as granary overseer. A typical granary had multiple officials. The overseer of the granary, a high-ranking scribe who tracked all inflows and outflows. The seal bearer, responsible for applying clay seals to doors or jars. The storehouse guards, often armed to prevent theft. The weighers and measurers, specialists who used balanced scales and measuring bins. When a delivery of grain arrived, say, from a taxed village, it was weighed, logged, and placed into a designated area. Every sack was accounted for. Every withdrawal, for temple offerings or worker rations, was recorded. Mistakes could be deadly. A miscount might mean rot, theft, or shortages during winter. And because grain was a form of tax, inaccurate records could anger officials or worse, the pharaoh himself. Some scribes were corrupt, others were brilliant, but all of them lived with the burden of numbers, drought, and the fear of famine. Egypt depended on a single crop, grown in a narrow strip of land. If the Nile flood was too low, the soil dried out, crops failed, hunger followed. We know from inscriptions and papyri that famine was a recurring fear. One of the most famous famines occurred during the first intermediate period around 2181 to 2055 BCE, when central authority broke down and local rulers scrambled to survive. An inscription from the tomb of Anktefi, a provincial governor, reads, "Gave bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked. I gave grain to the city in time of want." This wasn't just charity, it was a political statement. During famines, whoever controlled grain held power. The pharaohs knew this. So did the temples, so did the scribes. In hard times, records show drastic measures. Granaries opened to release emergency rations, woke, quotas reduced for laborers. Temple festivals scaled down to conserve food. Grain loans extended to farmers with delayed repayment schedules. Punishments for hoarding enforced by state inspectors. These responses had to be timely and precise, and they relied entirely on accurate grain accounting handled by scribes who knew both how much grain existed and where it was needed most. Grain as a political weapon, but not all scribes were benevolent. In times of famine or crisis, those with access to food could become oppressors as easily as providers. There are records, though sparse, of officials accused of skimming grain for personal profit, deliberately under-recording deliveries to temples, demanding bribes to release food, replacing beeswax seals with forgeries to falsify records. In such cases, famine became a tool of control. A community that defied a governor or failed to meet its labor quota might find its grain shipment delayed. A rival priesthood might be starved of offerings. An ambitious official might secretly build a private stockpile while villagers starved. This wasn't always widespread, but it was possible, as one ancient Egyptian proverb warns. Beware of the scribe who eats from two granaries. The role of temples in grain distribution. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic centers. Many owned farmland worked by laborers, and they collected grain as offerings. Some temples managed vast storehouses, acting as semi-independent economic hubs within the state. For example, the Temple of Karnak had its own fleet of grain boats. The Temple of Heliopolis operated multiple granaries across the delta. Priests managed agricultural calendars, flood tracking, and tax assessments. During festivals, temples distributed free bread and beer, a gesture of generosity, yes, but also a ritual duty. The gods were to be worshipped with offerings. In return, the people received food, and harmony was maintained. Scribes ensured this cycle remained intact. They recorded every offering, every withdrawal, every leftover loaf. and because temples were sometimes more efficient than state offices, many ordinary Egyptians trusted temple scribes more than government officials. Corruption, accountability, and audits, given the importance of grain. It's no surprise that Egypt developed systems of audit and inspection. Grain scribes were often subject to surprise inspections by traveling officials, weight verifications, using standard stones, seal integrity checks to ensure jars or doors weren't tampered with, cross-referencing records between scribe teams. We even have evidence of multi-scribe systems where 3 or 4 scribes independently tracked the same transaction, and the results were compared. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a method of internal control, a primitive version of checks and balances. But it also meant scribes were constantly watching one another. Careers could be ruined by accusations of fraud. Some tomb inscriptions proudly declared the deceased was true of voice or pure of grain record. In a world where lives depended on food, truth in numbers was sacred. Grain as a social equalizer. While Egypt had strong class divisions, grain blurred some lines. Rich or poor, priest or farmer, everyone needed grain, and because it circulated outside formal currency, it allowed social interactions across class boundaries. For example, a farmer might pay a local healer in barley, a widow might rent a room for a sack of wheat per month, a craftsman might sell a statue to a temple in exchange for 30 loaves. Scribes were the arbiters of these exchanges. Their records ensured fairness, resolved disputes, and offered legal protection. Grain allowed Egypt to function even without coinage because everyone, from the Nile Delta to the southern cataracts, understood the language of loaves. The quiet power of numbers. It is easy to look at ancient Egypt and see only monuments and kings, but behind every great structure was a system, behind every system, a scribe. These men didn't command armies, they didn't commune with gods, but they tracked the flood, counted the harvest, sealed the jars, and verified the weights. They built no pyramids, but without them, the pyramids wouldn't have risen. They wrote no hymns yet. They ensured the temples were fed and the gods honored. They didn't rule, but they wielded quiet, invisible power, controlling the kingdom not with force, but with figures. And when crisis struck, when drought dried the fields, when rats chewed through stores, when mouths went hungry, it was the scribe's judgment that determined who would eat and who would not. From scroll to scroll, how Egypt's grain system influenced empires and echoes today. For centuries, the careful scribes of ancient Egypt chronicled every grain transaction, flood cycle, and food distribution with quiet diligence. With ink and discipline, they recorded the rhythms of a civilization dependent on the Nile's moods and the fields it nourished. But what became of that system when empires shifted, dynasties fell, and Egypt's golden age waned? In this final section, we look at how Egypt's grain-based bureaucracy evolved under foreign rule, what long-term influence it had on the world, and how even today, echoes of those old scrolls whisper in our modern economic systems. The grain machine rolls on. Foreign rulers, same system. Egypt's greatness was not immune to decline. By 525 BCE, it fell to Persian conquest, and later to the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and eventually the Romans. Yet surprisingly, even as languages changed, religions shifted, and palaces crumbled, one thing remained mostly intact: the grain system. Each new ruling power recognized the critical importance of Egypt's agricultural engine. They didn't dismantle the scribal bureaucracy, they absorbed it. In fact, they leaned on it. The Persians retained Egypt's temple-based distribution systems, ensuring that local officials continued collecting grain taxes. Under the Ptolemaic Greeks 305 to 30 BCE, scribes became even more important as the administration became multilingual. Greek officials relied heavily on Egyptian clerks to manage native grain quotas. When Rome took over Egypt in 30 BCE, they declared it the breadbasket of the empire. At its peak, Egypt exported hundreds of thousands of tons of grain to feed the people of Rome. To make this possible, the Roman emperors improved infrastructure. Canals were dredged and expanded. Dranas were upgraded and built along new trade routes. Scribes were organized under a centralized record-keeping office. The Egyptian scribal system, quietly born in mud-brick storehouses, had now become the backbone of an imperial supply chain stretching across the Mediterranean. Alexandria, the grain port that fed Rome. If ancient Memphis was the heart of Old Kingdom, grain management, and Thebes, the soul of temple-led distribution, then under Roman rule, the city of Alexandria became the crown jewel of grain logistics. Founded by Alexander the Great, Alexandria housed not only the famous library in Pharos, lighthouse, but also one of the most important grain harbors in the world. Vast granaries lined the city's eastern harbor. Grain was stored, processed, and then loaded onto ships bound for Ostia. The port of Rome, a grain fleet known as the Alexandrian Corn Fleet, was protected by military escorts. These ships were vital to Rome's survival. In fact, Roman emperors took direct control over Egyptian grain production and logistics, bypassing local governors if necessary. And who made all this work? Not the emperors, not even the generals, that it was the scribes, now fluent in both Demotic, Egyptian, and Greek, who continued the detailed work of measuring harvests, organizing storage, recording grain tithes and payments, managing personnel and workers. Even in a cosmopolitan, imperial city like Alexandria, the administrative DNA of ancient Egypt still pulsed in papyrus scrolls and careful measurements. When the grain failed, famine and revolt. Despite this stability, Egypt's dependence on grain could still lead to disaster. There were times, especially in the Roman and Byzantine periods, when the Nile failed to flood adequately. Poor harvests led to inflation of grain prices, unpaid workers, especially on state projects, urban riots, particularly in Alexandria, desperation in rural regions, where local granaries dried up. Grain shortfalls had far-reaching consequences. One failed harvest might mean a brief crisis, but 2 or 3 in a row that could topple dynasties. In one letter from Roman Egypt circa 2nd century CE, a scribe writes, "The stores are light, the fields cracked. I fear the people will flee their duties. They curse the gods and call the scribes liars." This line speaks volumes. Scribes, as the face of grain authority, often bore the blame when the food ran out. They were, after all, the ones with the records, the ones who said how much grain there was or wasn't. They represented the system. When the system failed, so did they. A shift to coinage, the end of wheat as currency. By the later Roman period, Egypt, like much of the empire, transitioned more firmly into a monetary economy. Silver and bronze coins became more common, especially in cities. Farmers paid taxes in coin, laborers were paid in drachmas or denarii, and local markets listed prices in both weight and money. But grain didn't disappear as currency. In rural areas, barter continued well into the Byzantine era. A family might still pay their rent in wheat, or purchase tools with barley, even in places where coinage was used. Prices were often calculated in grain equivalents, a hangover from the older system. It wasn't until the full Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE that scribal administration truly transformed. Arabic became the dominant administrative language. Paper replaced papyrus. Centralized Islamic officials took over the tax system. But even then grain remained king. In fact, records show that some early Islamic governors of Egypt continued using local grain scribes, simply adapting their titles and tools. Lessons in paper and patience. So what does it mean that scribes tracked wheat for over 3,000 years? It means ancient Egypt's real strength wasn't just military or architectural, it was organizational. The same country that built the pyramids also built an economic and logistical machine, powered not by gears or electricity, but by scribes. Memory and ink. Fields timed by the stars, granaries guarded by law and priesthood, and in doing so, Egypt influenced the very nature of governance. Later empires, Assyria, Persia, Rome, even colonial administrations, centuries later learned the same lesson. If you want control, start with the food, track it, store it, count it, distribute it, and above all write it down. Echoes in the modern world. The legacy of Egypt's scribes can be felt in many modern practices, food subsidies and state grain reserves like India's Food Corporation or US wheat silos, agricultural mistaking, still a global government function, bureaucratic taxation systems, especially those built on land yields, civil service exams, rooted in meritocratic training systems like the scribal schools, data-based governance, where what is recorded defines policy. Even the humble grocery receipt, with its columns and totals, has roots in a practice first seen in Egypt over 4,000 years ago. And though no one today uses a reed pen on limestone to calculate a grain tithe, we still rely on numbers, records, and systems built on the bones of those same practices. A quiet revolution. That's easy to think of history as driven by warriors, emperors, or prophets. But sometimes, revolutions are quiet. They happen when someone decides to measure how high the river rose last year, count how many sacks of wheat remain in the store, mark which village paid its quota, note which worker was absent, and why. Actions, repeated over centuries, form civilization's nervous system. They allow for coordination, storage, planning and survival. The Egyptian scribes, with their black-stained fingers and weary eyes, gave us more than records. They gave us continuity. They proved that success is not only about what you build, how well you record, plan and sustain. The final scroll. The last known Egyptian hieratic and demotic texts date from around the 5th century CE. After that, the language faded, the script disappeared, the scribal class vanished into history, but their scrolls survived, thanks to the dry climate and careful burial practices. Thousands of papyrus fragments, astraca and stone inscriptions still exist. They rest in museums and archives. Their symbols, still legible. And every time a modern historian deciphers one, we hear, once more, the voice of a long-dead clerk. Harvest complete, 22 sacks sealed by the overseer. Signed Nessaman, scribe of the granary. It's not dramatic, it's not poetic, but it is the heartbeat of civilization. As we close this story, ask yourself, in a future where digital records replace paper, and databases replace scrolls, who will be the scribes, and will they too be forgotten, or remembered as the silent architects of order? Story 6, Soap, Smoke, and Silence. The hidden lives of Roman public bath attendants. Before the steam, the morning rituals of Rome's quietest workers. You likely know the grand imagery. Marble columns, warm waters, mosaics glimmering under candlelight. The famed thermae of ancient Rome were more than just places to bathe. They were social hubs, fitness centers, libraries, art galleries, even temples of gossip. But what about the people who made them run? Behind the splash of cold water, the cloud of steam, and the perfumed oils lay a cast of largely unseen workers, the bath attendants. These weren't senators or gladiators. They weren't philosophers or generals. They were often enslaved, or freedmen. Their days were long, their tasks repetitive, their recognition non-existent. Yet without them, Roman baths would have crumbled both physically and socially. This story is about the quiet workforce that swept, scrubbed, heated, and endured. We'll begin in the early hours, long before Rome's citizens arrived to socialize and soak. Before sunrise, entering the baths, it's not even dawn when Marcus, a fictional bath attendant based on records from the 1st century CE, arrives at the thermae. He's one of dozens on staff at a mid-sized public bath in the Subura district of Rome. The sky is still ink dark. The city is silent, except for the flicker of torches and the low growl of early cartwheels. Marcus's first duty, check the furnaces. The Hypocostan underground heating system requires hours of stoking before the water and rooms are ready. Marcus and 3 others descend into the bathhouse basement, a low sooty maze of stone pillars, where fires are kept burning beneath the floors. There's no glamour here, just charcoal dust in the throat, splinters in hands from wood, bundles, burns, on forearms from iron tools, and the looming threat of smoke inhalation. These men are furnicury firekeepers. Their job is simple: keep the caldarium hot bath boiling, the tepidarium warm, and the laconicum dry sauna stifling. They sweat in darkness while the city sleeps. The routine of preparation. By sunrise, the bathhouse begins to transform. More attendants arrive, some slaves, others freedmen working for pay. Marcus moves upstairs to begin floor scrubbing, using reed brushes and buckets of yesterday's water. He scrapes away oils, hair, and sandal grit from the mosaic tiles. If he's lucky, a guest dropped a coin yesterday, now hidden in a drainage corner. Other attendants are tasked with polishing bronze fixtures, refilling oil, flasks used for body cleansing, stocking towels and linen wraps, cleaning benches, stools, and massage tables. Each task must be completed before the doors open, or the balneator, the bath manager, will dock wages or worse. There's also security. Lockable cupboards were rare, so some attendants were expected to memorize the faces of repeat patrons and guard their clothes while they bathed. Robberies could mean fines or flogging, a job of endurance, not honor. Being a bath attendant was considered lowlier, trade for the overlooked. Some were property of the state or wealthy bath sponsors. Others were freed slaves who stayed in the trade, as it was one of the few available forms of employment. A few were hereditary attendants, born into families of bath workers. Roman elites often treated attendants with disdain. Satirists like Juvenal mocked them, and playwrights portrayed them as either buffoons or background noise. Yet they endured. Why? Because in a bustling city of over 1 million people, the baths were always busy. There was always work. Some days were miserable, yes, but others brought tips. a smile from a regular visitor, or a chance to hear gossip from the upper class. Occasionally, a kind patron might even sponsor an attendant's freedom, offer a better job, or leave behind food. Wasn't wealth, but it was survival. Tools of the trade. Roman bath attendants were expected to be quick, observant, and skilled in a handful of tasks. Strigeling. Using a strigeling, a curved metal scraper, attendants would help patrons remove oil and sweat. Application. They rubbed perfumed oils into guests' skin, sometimes as part of a light massage. Laundry handling. Towels and loincloths were cleaned off-site and delivered daily. Body hair removal. Some guests expected assistance with plucking or shaving, not a glamorous task. Water pouring in the caldarium. Guests might ask for cold water poured over their heads. Attendants had to carry large ceramic jugs without spilling. All of this done barefoot, often in steam-heavy rooms with slippery floors and loud echoes. The only real break came during mid-afternoon when foot traffic briefly slowed and staff could eat a cold barley porridge or fig ration. Life beyond the baths. What did these workers do after hours? For many, not much. After a 12 to 14-hour shift, most were too exhausted to roam the city if they were slaves. They returned to a dormitory, often underground or behind the bathhouse. If they were free, they might share a cramped apartment in the insular Roman tenement blocks, spend evening hours in noisy taverns, visit temples to pray for protection from disease, a constant threat in moist public spaces. Few bath attendants were literate. Fewer still left written records, but in rare cases, they show up in epitaphs, brief tomb inscriptions that hint at long, underappreciated careers. Here lies Lucius, strigial, servant, faithful and fast, beloved by the old and the young. To Marcus, who knew every tile of the Thermae and every gossip of the steam, these lines are humble but revealing. They speak to a profession that, though invisible to history books, was vital to Rome's social machinery, early public health, or health hazard. There's long been debate among historians. Were Roman baths a boon to public health or a breeding ground for disease? Attendants sat at the center of this paradox. They cleaned, but had no disinfectants. They poured water, but couldn't guarantee its purity. They dealt with infected sores, lice, foot fungus, and rashes without gloves or protection. And yet, the bathhouse was where people came to cleanse, relax, and recover from minor ailments. Herbal steam rooms, hot compresses, and massage services were available and administered by attendants with basic training. Some scholars suggest that attendants likely picked up informal medical knowledge over time, diagnosing skin problems or recommending oils. They became, in a way, informal nurses to a city that lacked organized hospitals. A strange kind of power, though socially low. Bath attendants were witnesses to everything. They overheard senators making deals. They saw lovers meet in secret corners. They knew who skipped their workout and who paid for 2 massages a day. They even caught glimpses of priests without their robes, generals without their armor, and this gave them a strange kind of power. Sometimes bath attendants became confidants. A wealthy patron might talk to them like a bartender. A nervous young man might ask them for advice. An old woman might pay extra for silence. There are stories, though rare, of attendants blackmailing powerful men, of others being entrusted with secrets, and of 1 or 2 who rose above their station, buying freedom, marrying well, and leaving the baths behind. But most remained, day after day, in the background of Rome's most public yet private space. Midday mayhem, sweat, soap, and social classes collide. As the Roman sun climbed higher in the sky, so too did the bustle of the Thermae, public bathhouses that served as the heart of social life in ancient Rome. And for the quiet army of bath attendants, the serene early hours now gave way to chaotic, relentless movement. This section plunges into the busiest time of day, inside a Roman bathhouse, when citizens from all walks of life arrived, not just to wash, but to converse, conduct business, flirt, argue, and observe. And it was the attendants who had to keep this organized madness flowing smoothly. Let's return to Marcus, the fictional bath attendant we met earlier. The fires have been stoked, the pools are hot, the floors are scrubbed. Now he stands ready at the entrance as the first guests arrive, opening the gates. By the late morning, typically the 6th hour of the Roman day, around 11 a.m., the bathhouse gates open. For a small fee or free entry in baths funded by wealthy patrons, Romans pour in, and with them comes noise. Sandals, scuffing mosaic tiles, greetings, arguments, flirtation, and laughter. The splash of water from stone basins. Vendors outside shouting, offers for combs, oils, and snacks. For the attendants, this signals the start of the second shift. Each one has a post. Some stand by the oil jars and strigils, others wait by the lockers. A few guard the entrances to hot rooms, and many like Marcus are now stationed inside the tepidarium and caldarium, tasked with helping patrons cleanse, massage, and relax. There is no break now. For the next few hours, the baths are full, the clients all of Rome in one building. Roman baths were one of the rare places where class mingled, if not equally, then at least physically. In a single afternoon, an attendant might serve a senator's wife, adorned in gold rings, a freed slave eager to display his modest wealth, a grain merchant from the provinces, a local gossip with sharp eyes and sharper words, an athlete cooling off after training, a soldier home on leave. The thermi were designed to be inclusive. The famous baths of Caracalla could serve over 1,500 people at once. Even modest neighborhood baths saw hundreds daily. That diversity meant attendants had to be cautious. An insult to a senator's son could end in a beating, but too much attention paid to a lower-class visitor could bring scorn from the elite. Attendants learned to read faces, recognize regulars, and adjust their tone with subtle shifts. The rooms and their rhythms. The structure of Roman baths followed a pattern, and so did the work of their attendants. Patrons usually moved through the following spaces: appetiterium, changing room. Attendants collected and stored clothing, sometimes offering cloth wraps or slippers. Theft was a risk here, and attendants were often blamed. Marcus remembers names and faces, trying to mentally link each person to their belongings. Tepidarium, warm room. This was the transitional space. Attendants helped guests acclimate to heat, apply oil, and prepare for the hot bath. Some massaged limbs or fetched warm towels. The air smells of lavender oil, smoke from braziers, and damp stone. Caldarium, hot room, the most intense. Here, steam filled the room like fog. Visibility was low, the heat was stifling. Attendants kept water basins full, scraped sweat and oil from guests with strigils, and poured cool water over those who became faint. Marcus must stay alert. He's seen men collapse from the heat. Laconicum, dry sauna, less frequented, but still part of the path. Attendants here managed charcoal fires and kept towels dry. Frigidarium, cold plunge. After the heat, guests dove or stepped into the icy water. Here attendants offered brief rubdowns, helped with towels, and braced themselves for sudden splashes. Some guests repeated the circuit twice. Some lingered in one room. A few, especially the wealthy, demanded exclusive service, the work of touch. Many bath attendants acted as informal not professionally trained, but experienced through repetition. They used olive oil mixed with herbs, coriander, myrrh, or laurel, strong knuckles to press into shoulders, calves, and backs, strigils to scrape off dead skin and sweat. This was not the soft candlelit massage of modern spas. It was brisk, sometimes painful, and often interrupted. A man might grunt about his aching joints. A woman might complain the oil is too cold. One patron asks for silence. Another chats endlessly. For attendants, touch was a skill and a risk. An errant hand could be seen as disrespect. A rough scrape might draw blood, but when done well, it earned tips or at least kind words. Noise, gossip, and unseen eyes. Roman baths weren't just for cleaning. They were also hotbeds of gossip and politics. Senators whispered about rivals. Lovers arranged secret meetings. Slaves traded rumors. Merchants struck deals over oil jars. Attendants, though silent, heard everything, and sometimes that knowledge was valuable. A clever attendant might pass a rumor along to a friend, a supervisor, even a patron. Others kept what they heard locked inside, using it only when needed. There were no written codes, but every experienced attendant knew. Speak little, observe everything, remember what matters. Some bathhouses even had informal hierarchies among staff: senior attendants who knew the best tippers, the most generous guests, or which ones were dangerous when drunk. Disasters and daily hazards. Not all bathhouse days passed peacefully. Some afternoons brought disaster. Fires, hypercost systems could overheat, setting wooden beams or oils alight. Attendants were first responders, smothering flames, evacuating rooms. Injuries, wet tiles caused falls. Steam rooms sometimes led to fainting. Cold plunges caused shock. Attendants were expected to help, sometimes carrying full-grown men to benches or applying cold cloths. Fights, arguments over oil, theft, accusations, or romantic jealousy sometimes turned violent. Attendants had no weapons, but they had experience. Some wielded long wooden poles, not to strike but to separate combatants. Vomiting, nosebleeds, or worse. Guests often overindulged before bathing. Attendants dealt with the aftermath, floors, replacing linens, airing rooms. And always, blame landed on the attendants if something went wrong. The midday lull around the 9th hour, around 3 p.m. The rush slows. Many guests have finished their bath and moved to the palestra exercise yard or the library. Others lounge outside, sipping watered wine or eating figs. Attendants now rush to refill oil jars, collect towels for washing. Relight braziers, scrub stains from benches and tiles. Marcus wipes sweat from his brow. His hands are sore, his feet ache. He pockets a small coin left as a tip, tucks it into his belt. A guest waves. He rushes to assist again. There is no real rest, just a change in rhythm. Unseen stories. Despite their anonymity, bath attendants appear in fragments of Roman life. A fresco from Pompeii shows two attendants holding towels, their faces expressionless. In a tomb inscription, a freedman named Petronius proudly claims 25 years of bath service. A surviving letter describes a man scolding his slave, "You clean worse than a bath boy." These glimpses reveal the persistence of their work. They didn't write history, they weren't named in epics, but they touched the bodies of emperors, plebeians, and poets alike. They were essential and invisible, a contradiction history rarely acknowledges. After the steam, the closing rituals and legacy of Rome's forgotten laborers, as the Roman sun dipped behind marble rooftops and the hum of the city softened into a slow evening chorus of carts, sandals, and chatter, the once bustling thermae began to empty. The echoes of laughter and gossip faded. Pools, once alive with movement, now lay still murky from the day's use. For the patrons, the day at the baths ended in relaxation, but for the attendants, the real work was only just beginning. This final section explores the closing rituals, the unseen burdens, and the historical footprint left behind by Roman bath attendants. From scrubbing stone to surviving silence, these laborers held up one of history's most iconic social spaces, and when all was quiet, truly quiet, they remained. The end of the bath day. Most Roman bathhouses closed by the 11th hour, 1 hour before sundown. Some, especially those funded by private benefactors, stayed open later, but as daylight faded, even the most popular thermae wound down. A bell or horn often signaled last entry. Attendants stationed at entrances turned away latecomers. Inside, others gently urged remaining guests to move along, though gently could quickly turn to firmness, especially if drunkenness lingered. Some bathhouses allowed for evening shifts, but for the full-time attendants like Marcus, our fictional stand-in, drawn from real sources, this marked the transition from service to sanitation. Guests were gone. Now, it was time to restore order, cleaning the temple of the body. The Romans treated their baths with almost religious reverence. But what lay behind that polished surface was hard labor. Draining pools, the frigidarium, cold plunge, and caldarium. Hot bath needed draining on a rotating schedule, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. This involved pulling heavy plugs, opening stone channels, and clearing filters clogged with hair and debris. Scrubbing tiles, slippery floors coated with sweat. Oil and dust were scrubbed with sandpaste, reeds, and bronze-bristled brushes. The smell soon warmed oil, stale water, mildew was powerful. Attendants knelt until their backs ached, cleaning strigils and oil jars. These tools, used all day by dozens or hundreds of people, were cleaned with ash, vinegar, or even urine, which contains ammonia. It was a pungent task. Laundering towels and loincloths, while many towels were sent to off-site laundries called fulanike. Attendants had to rinse the worst soiling before transport. This meant dipping linen in cold basins, wringing them by hand, and bundling them in red baskets. Extinguishing braziers and fires. Hypocaust fires were damped but not fully extinguished, lest relighting be difficult the next day. Still, ashes were shoveled, embers pushed back, and walls inspected for cracks, checking for forgotten items. Rings, earrings, amulets, combs, even togas were sometimes left behind. Attendants were expected to deposit valuables in the balneator's office. Theft was punished harshly. It was often dark by the time they finished, and in the cold seasons, this work occurred in chill rooms, with damp stone underfoot and stiff limbs from fatigue. Attendants in silence. There was a kind of quiet beauty to this time when the baths no longer roared with conversation, and the only sounds were the splash of water, the drag of brooms, and the low hum of voices in Latin or Greek. Some attendants spoke little, others shared jokes or muttered complaints. In small moments, There might be laughter if someone slipped into a puddle, or found a forgotten coin. Occasionally an attendant would pause, stare into the surface of a calm pool, and wonder about the people they had served that day. Did the senator notice his sandals had been polished? Would the young merchant tip tomorrow? Was the girl in the corner ill, or simply tired? These silent reflections filled the end of the workday. Meals, rest, and return. When the labor was done, the attendants dispersed. Slaves returned to servants. Quarters often small, unventilated rooms behind the bathhouse or in nearby structures. Dinner might consist of barley, porridge, lentils, or dried figs, hard bread if lucky, a bit of cheese or olive oil. They slept early, exhausted, on red mats or thin pallets. Freedmen, if employed independently or by the city, returned to shared rooms. In insulae Rome's crowded apartment blocks, the higher the floor, the cheaper the rent. Fires were a constant danger. So were collapsing staircases. Some attendants had families, though most were single men. Children occasionally followed their fathers into the trade, learning to polish tiles or carry buckets. It was a humble life, one of repetition, modest coin, and quiet endurance. Hierarchy among the staff. Despite their lowly status, bath attendants had their own internal hierarchies. The balneator, this was the bathhouse manager, often a freedman himself. He assigned duties, handled customer complaints, and reported to city authorities or private sponsors. He could be harsh or fair but was almost always feared. Senior attendants, usually older men with years of service, they trained newcomers, and knew the building's secrets, how to coax warmth from a weak brazier where the roof leaked, who tipped well. Specialists, some focused on massage, others were oil handlers or furnace operators. There was even the rare female attendant balneatrix in women's baths, likely responsible for helping noble women with cleansing rituals. Young apprentices, often teenage boys, they did the hardest jobs, fetching wood, carrying water, lifting baskets. Seniority brought no luxury, just slightly less pain, disease, danger, and disrespect. Bathhouses, those centers of health, were also breeding grounds for illness. Skin diseases, foot infections, eye ailments from smoke, respiratory problems from mold and constant steam. Attendants were exposed to all of it, every day, and though they kept the baths safe and clean, they were rarely respected. Satirists mocked their lowly status. Wealthy patrons yelled at them, groped them, or ignored them completely. There were even laws forbidding certain classes from entering through the same doors as attendants, despite the fact that attendants knew every inch of the facility better than any guest. Still, they returned each day, not out of love, but out of necessity. The last echoes, death and memory. Attendants rarely made history books, but some appear in epitaphs, humble inscriptions on stone or brick, left by family or colleagues. Examples: here lies Sextus, oil-bearer of the baths of Titus, gentle with the old, quick with the young, honest in all measures. To Claudia, strigil keeper, who served 3 generations with strength and laughter. Such words are rare. Most bath workers vanished namelessly into time, yet we know they were there, because without them the baths, the pride of Roman life, would not have functioned. The slow decline of the Roman baths. As the Western Roman Empire fell into disrepair in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, so too did the Thermae. Invasions disrupted grain shipments, wealthy sponsors fled or died, maintenance budgets dried up, plumbing systems cracked, heating collapsed without wood or coal. Many bathhouses were abandoned. Some were repurposed as housing, marketplaces, or fortresses. Others became Christian basics, and with them vanished the role of the bath attendant. The furnaces went cold. The strigils rusted. The oil jars dried out. But the echoes of their work remained etched in the stones, carved in graffiti, buried in layers of ash and silence. Legacy, labor behind the luxury. Modern spas, saunas, gyms, and wellness centers trace their roots to Roman baths. But rarely do we consider the labor behind the luxury. The bath attendant was not just a cleaner, he was a firekeeper, a mass SEUR, a watchman, a porter, a healer, a listener, a custodian of civility. He witnessed Roman society in all its forms, vulnerable, joyful, and cruel. And though he held no power, he sustained a system that promised health, order, and ritual in an otherwise chaotic world. One last glance. Let's return one final time to Marcus. He stands alone in the caldarium, steam curling around the dark corners of the room. A single lamp flickers. The pool reflects the ceiling's cracked fresco. His day is done. He sets down the broom. He exhales. He stares into the water, not as a servant, not as a forgotten worker, but as a man who knows this space better than anyone alive. Tomorrow he'll return, but for now he closes the doors behind him, the stone clicks into place, and once again Rome sleeps.